Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Whether you believe in the paranormal or just enjoy spooky stories, this experience changed everything for me and my friends. It turned one complete skeptic into a true believer and left us with chilling memories we'll never forget. I've always been fascinated by urban exploration. For those unfamiliar with the term, it's when you venture into abandoned buildings to photograph and document what remains. Living in New Zealand's Otago region, we're surrounded by stunning Victorian-era architecture set against dramatic landscapes, rolling hills, dense forests, and misty valleys. Together with my friends Melissa and Ryan, I had been exploring various abandoned places for months. But there was one location that kept drawing us back: the old St. Augustine's Orphanage. The massive stone building stood 3 stories tall, its dark windows staring out like hollow eyes across the valley below. We had visited twice before without incident, but on our 3rd visit, everything changed. The building's condition had deteriorated significantly since our last exploration. Many of the floors were unstable, with gaping holes revealing the levels below. Still, we weren't about to let that stop us. Finding our usual entry point boarded up, we almost gave up. But after searching the perimeter, we spotted a section of the lower roof that had partially collapsed. Using a nearby tree and each other as makeshift ladders, we managed to climb inside. The atmosphere felt different this time. An unsettling heaviness hung in the air that I couldn't explain. Being somewhat spiritually sensitive, I felt this more intensely than my friends. Ryan, ever the skeptic, just laughed and said we were being dramatic. We explored the upper floors, cringing at the fresh graffiti that now marred the once elegant walls. Eventually, we found ourselves on the ground floor, standing in one of the long corridors. The 3 of us formed a loose triangle, with me standing in a door frame facing the hallway. Melissa stood to my left, while Ryan was positioned to my right. That's when it happened. Something touched my back, a firm, deliberate pressure that felt like fingers slowly dragging from my neck down to my spine. The sensation was so real, so physical, that I screamed and jumped forward. My friends stared at me in confusion, asking if I'd hurt myself. For several seconds, I couldn't form words. My head was spinning, and I felt dizzy and disoriented. When I finally managed to explain what I'd felt, Melissa's face went pale. Ryan, however, remained skeptical, suggesting I must have brushed against something or maybe felt a spider. But I knew better. Seconds before it happened, every hair on my body had stood on end, as if warning me of what was coming. Thoroughly unsettled, Melissa and I convinced Ryan it was time to leave. As we made our way back to our exit point, a burning sensation suddenly spread across my back, like someone had dragged hot coals down my spine. Panicking, I asked Melissa to check if anything was there. Her silence told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. When she finally found her voice, she called Ryan over to look. The expression on his face, a mixture of disbelief and fear, made my anxiety spike. They nervously told me there were 3 distinct scratches running down my back, exactly where I'd felt the touch and burning sensation. Ryan tried to rationalize it at first, suggesting I must have scratched myself or caught my back on something. But after examining the marks more closely, he realized that was impossible. The scratches went under my shirt strap, something I couldn't have done without them noticing. We left as quickly as we safely could, climbing back through the collapsed roof section and walking a short distance from the building before stopping to look back at its looming silhouette. We all agreed to head back to the car and never return. The 15-minute walk back felt endless. The whole time, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Occasionally, we thought we heard footsteps behind us, though when we turned to look, the path was empty. That day changed Ryan completely. After years of dismissing paranormal stories, he became a believer. Something about seeing those inexplicable scratches on my back had shattered his skepticism. Though we swore never to return to St. Augustine's, we all feel strangely drawn back to it. It's like an itch we can't scratch. Maybe it's the mystery of what happened that day, or maybe it's something more sinister calling us back. Either way, the memory of those scratches and that burning sensation still gives me chills to this day. This happened around 9 in the evening on a cold winter night in Michigan. I was with some friends in my car outside one of their houses. We were 5 people total, myself behind the wheel, my friend Thomas in the passenger seat, and 3 others in the back seat of my SUV. We were just talking about random things when suddenly, I felt this intense sensation crawl down my spine, like we were being watched. I turned to look at Thomas in the passenger seat, and he looked up at me at the exact same moment, his face pale as if he'd seen a ghost. I asked him if he felt it too, and he nodded. None of our friends in the back seat seemed to notice anything unusual. We tried to ignore the feeling and continued our conversation. But a few minutes later, that same sensation returned, even stronger than before. Thomas suddenly looked past me, through the driver's side window which my back was facing, and told me not to turn around. The others still hadn't noticed anything, but Thomas insisted there was something out there. We took turns describing to each other what we sensed. It appeared to be pure white and humanoid, but the details are fuzzy in my memory. After a minute or so, it vanished, but that's when things got even stranger. Thomas and I both felt the presence circling around the car, and we began to see glowing green circles moving rapidly around us. It's hard to explain. We couldn't exactly see them with our eyes. It was more like knowing they were there. The circles started moving faster and faster, until we were both nearly panicking. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the circles vanished. Thomas and I were leaning back to talk to our friends in the middle row, when there was a flash of white light on the sidewalk behind the car. A creature sprinted toward us. It was pure white, bipedal but somewhat inhuman, and incredibly tall, at least 7 feet. It had an oddly shaped head, long, thin black hair, black eyes, and what looked like claws. Thomas and I screamed simultaneously. I started the car, and we got out of there as fast as possible. Once we were far away, we took turns describing what we'd seen to each other, and our descriptions matched perfectly. When I took everyone home and was driving back alone, I could still feel the presence behind me. I couldn't tell if it was in the car or not, But whenever I stopped at a traffic light or sign, I felt it catching up, so I sped the rest of the way home. When I finally got home, the presence was gone. Both Thomas and I could sense that whatever it was hadn't meant to harm us. It just wanted to make its presence known. Nothing like this has happened before or since. The only connecting factor between Thomas and me was that we were both religious at the time. The strangest part is that none of our other friends saw or felt anything that night. We've spent countless hours trying to make sense of what happened, but we still can't explain it. Whatever we encountered that winter night in Michigan, it left us with an experience we'll never forget, and a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Let me share a truly bizarre and terrifying experience from my childhood. This happened years ago when I was in 7th grade. I'm now preparing to start college. The incident occurred in northern Wisconsin, where my family lived in a modest suburban home. I shared a room with my younger brother, and I had the top bunk of our bed. It was summer, and since our room would get really stuffy, we had window screens installed to let in the cool night air. Being a light sleeper, I woke up in the middle of the night to hear a peculiar sound light, rhythmic scratching on the screen and raspy breathing. I rolled onto my stomach and peered over the side of my bed. What I saw next is forever burned into my memory. There at our second-story window was something that shouldn't have been possible. The creature was extremely pale, with unnaturally long, thin limbs. It had no clothing or hair, and its face was flat and rounded with no visible nose or ears. Its lips were impossibly thin, and its eyes were deeply sunken. The thing was lightly scratching at the screen, looking around my room with an almost casual curiosity. It didn't seem to notice me watching it, and strangest of all, it wasn't trying to break in. The scratching wasn't frenzied or aggressive. It was almost methodical, like it was simply making its presence known. I watched it in silent terror for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. Eventually, I managed to crawl backwards down the ladder and into our living room, where I spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch, too terrified to move. To give you an idea of its size, our window is about 5 feet off the ground, and this thing was hunched over while peering in. It had to have been at least 7 feet tall when standing straight. A few months later, my family went on a camping trip with my scout troop. One of the kids' families owned some property deep in the Wisconsin woods, far from civilization. I woke up in our large family tent to hear that same distinctive scratching, long and rhythmic on the nylon. I could see impressions of long fingers being made on the wall of the tent. I lay there perfectly still until it moved away. Later, I heard it repeating the same process on other tents throughout the campsite before it finally wandered off. I didn't say anything until my father pulled me aside the next morning and said he had heard the same thing, which had woken him up as well. But there's one final detail that makes this even more chilling. Before we went to sleep that night in our tents, there was a long, haunting scream from the woods. It sounded like a hybrid of a person and some animal being killed. One final sound of pain before everything fell silent. Everyone just stood there, frozen. Keep in mind, these were experienced woodsmen, and they hadn't heard anything like that before in their lives. Fox vocalizations are noticeably canine, Mountain lion sounds are distinctly feline, but this was entirely unnatural. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in our world, but somehow does. To this day, I can perfectly recall the sound of those methodical scratches, the sight of those long, pale fingers pressing against the screen, and that haunting scream echoing through the dark Wisconsin woods. Some things once experienced never leave you. When I was a baby, my father took me from my mother, not out of love or desperation, but because he was a sociopath who wanted to hurt her in the worst way possible. I was missing for nearly 6 years. My face appeared on milk cartons, the whole tragic story. My father was an ex-military survivalist who smuggled weapons across the Canadian border, among other illegal activities. During those formative years of my life, I was surrounded by criminals and raised by this neglectful monster. The trauma I endured was severe. By the time I was located and returned to my mother, just after I turned 6, I knew how to load, clean, and assemble several different types of firearms. I was taught to aim for anyone in uniform, and I never missed a target, living or inanimate. I'd been left alone for days at a time repeatedly, so I became completely self-sufficient. I never went to school and rarely interacted with other children. I was essentially a feral child. I didn't trust adults, or anyone for that matter. In my experience, most people wore masks, hiding their true nature. Fortunately, I was eventually returned to a loving home with my mother and stepfather. Through their love, therapy, and protection, I managed to become a relatively normal and surprisingly mentally healthy woman, albeit with some lingering quirks. The point of sharing this background is to explain the kind of person I am. I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. I don't take abuse from anyone. Having grown up the way I did, I studied people intensely as a defense mechanism. I became very good at reading others and their emotions, sometimes even the feelings they wouldn't admit to themselves. I developed an obsession with security. I'm hypervigilant about my surroundings, always carry some form of protection, and immediately note every exit and entrance when entering a new space. My stepfather, a former biker and bouncer at a rough bar, taught me how to take down larger opponents. You'd think all this would have prepared me for anything. But this story is about one of the few times in my adult life when someone slipped through all my defenses and nearly got to my young daughters. It's one thing to fear for your own safety, but to fear for your children, that's an entirely different kind of terror. I was managing a medical office inside a large residential rehabilitation center in Portland. The residents ranged from homeless individuals with mental illness to former inmates on parole. I actually enjoyed my work and never felt unsafe there, but it was exhausting. One Friday, after a 50-hour work week, I couldn't wait to get home. The building I worked in was an old converted monastery, a 4-story stone behemoth. I'd been running up and down 3 of those floors all week, and I was bone tired. The commute home wasn't simple. My babysitter lived near Forest Park, while I lived in the Hawthorne district. The fastest route involved walking 2 blocks to catch a bus, then taking the light rail across the city, picking up my girls, and finally making another 15-minute trek on foot to our apartment complex. By the time I collected my girls, I was ready to collapse. My 7-year-old held my hand while I carried my 3-year-old on my hip. Looking back, I must have appeared an easy target, an exhausted mother struggling with children and bags. When we boarded our final train, I noticed only one other passenger, a disheveled man in the last car. I observed him quickly, making mental notes as was my habit. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with unkempt dark hair and several layers of stained clothes, topped by an oversized coat. He held a tall beer can and seemed lost in his own world. Despite my extensive experience working with the homeless population, something felt off. The man's appearance was deliberately disheveled, but I noticed his teeth were perfectly white and maintained. His facial hair had distinct lines, as if recently and carefully trimmed. Then his demeanor changed completely. His slurred speech disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculated tone. He began moving toward us, his right hand concealed inside his jacket. We were alone, several cars away from any other passengers. I didn't wait to find out what he was hiding. I gathered my children and moved swiftly between cars, my heart pounding. But he followed, his footsteps getting closer. When I glanced back, his eyes were no longer unfocused. They were sharp and predatory. At our final stop, with no crowd to disappear into, I knew we were vulnerable. The station was above ground, and the walk home would take us through poorly lit areas. My adrenaline surged as I heard the car doors open behind us. I dropped my bags, told my older daughter to stay behind me, and set my toddler down. In one fluid motion, I turned, pulled out my pocket knife, and took a defensive stance. I felt like I grew 3 times my size, powered by maternal instinct and pure adrenaline. The man froze when he saw the knife. We locked eyes for a moment. His widened in surprise, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. He looked at my children, then back at me, before turning and running off the train. We made it home safely that night, but the incident haunts me. It showed me that despite all my preparation and experience, there are still predators skilled enough to slip through our defenses. But it also showed me that when protecting our children, we're capable of facing any threat, no matter how terrifying. When I was a baby, my father took me from my mother, not out of love or desperation, but because he was a sociopath who wanted to hurt her in the worst way possible. I was missing for nearly 6 years. My face appeared on milk cartons, the whole tragic story. My father was an ex-military survivalist who smuggled weapons across the Canadian border, among other illegal activities. During those formative years of my life, I was surrounded by criminals and raised by this neglectful monster. The trauma I endured was severe. By the time I was located and returned to my mother, just after I turned 6, I knew how to load, clean, and assemble several different types of firearms. I was taught to aim for anyone in uniform, and I never missed a target, living or inanimate. I'd been left alone for days at a time repeatedly, so I became completely self-sufficient. I never went to school and rarely interacted with other children. I was essentially a feral child. I didn't trust adults, or anyone for that matter. In my experience, most people wore masks, hiding their true nature. Fortunately, I was eventually returned to a loving home with my mother and stepfather. Through their love, therapy, and protection, I managed to become a relatively normal and surprisingly mentally healthy woman, albeit with some lingering quirks. The point of sharing this background is to explain the kind of person I am. I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. I don't take abuse from anyone. Having grown up the way I did, I studied people intensely as a defense mechanism. I became very good at reading others and their emotions, sometimes even the feelings they wouldn't admit to themselves. I developed an obsession with security. I'm hypervigilant about my surroundings, always carry some form of protection, and immediately note every exit and entrance when entering a new space. My stepfather, a former biker and bouncer at a rough bar, taught me how to take down larger opponents. You'd think all this would have prepared me for anything. But this story is about one of the few times in my adult life when someone slipped through all my defenses and nearly got to my young daughters. It's one thing to fear for your own safety, but to fear for your children, that's an entirely different kind of terror. I was managing a medical office inside a large residential rehabilitation center in Portland. The residents ranged from homeless individuals with mental illness to former inmates on parole. I actually enjoyed my work and never felt unsafe there, but it was exhausting. One Friday, after a 50-hour work week, I couldn't wait to get home. The building I worked in was an old converted monastery, a 4-story stone behemoth. I'd been running up and down 3 of those floors all week, and I was bone tired. The commute home wasn't simple. My babysitter lived near Forest Park, while I lived in the Hawthorne district. The fastest route involved walking 2 blocks to catch a bus, then taking the light rail across the city, picking up my girls, and finally making another 15-minute trek on foot to our apartment complex. By the time I collected my girls, I was ready to collapse. My 7-year-old held my hand while I carried my 3-year-old on my hip. Looking back, I must have appeared an easy target, an exhausted mother struggling with children and bags. When we boarded our final train, I noticed only one other passenger, a disheveled man in the last car. I observed him quickly, making mental notes as was my habit. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with unkempt dark hair and several layers of stained clothes topped by an oversized coat. He held a tall beer can and seemed lost in his own world. Despite my extensive experience working with the homeless population, something felt off. The man's appearance was deliberately disheveled, but I noticed his teeth were perfectly white and maintained. His facial hair had distinct lines, as if recently and carefully trimmed. Then his demeanor changed completely. His slurred speech disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculated tone. He began moving toward us, his right hand concealed inside his jacket. We were alone, several cars away from any other passengers. I didn't wait to find out what he was hiding. I gathered my children and moved swiftly between cars, my heart pounding. But he followed, his footsteps getting closer. When I glanced back, his eyes were no longer unfocused. They were sharp and predatory. At our final stop, with no crowd to disappear into, I knew we were vulnerable. The station was above ground, and the walk home would take us through poorly lit areas. My adrenaline surged as I heard the car doors open behind us. I dropped my bags, told my older daughter to stay behind me, and set my toddler down. In one fluid motion, I turned, pulled out my pocket knife and took a defensive stance. I felt like I grew 3 times my size, powered by maternal instinct and pure adrenaline. The man froze when he saw the knife. We locked eyes for a moment. His widened in surprise, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. He looked at my children, then back at me, before turning and running off the train. We made it home safely that night, but the incident haunts me. It showed me that despite all my preparation and experience, there are still predators skilled enough to slip through our defenses. But it also showed me that when protecting our children, we're capable of facing any threat, no matter how terrifying. Back in 1998, I was driving by myself from visiting my mother in Minnesota back to Arizona. I was in my old Toyota station wagon, transporting an antique oak desk that had belonged to my grandfather. I've always been nervous about driving at night, constantly fighting the irrational fear that someone might be lurking in my back seat. Maybe it's from watching too many horror movies, or perhaps my mother's constant warnings about traveling alone had finally gotten to me. I was in the Army and frequently drove back and forth to visit her. She would lecture me about sleeping at rest stops or gas stations, insisting that someone would kidnap and murder me. But I usually ignored her concerns, not wanting to waste money on motels. It was around midnight on a desolate stretch of highway, with no other cars in sight, when a red pickup truck appeared behind me, flashing its lights and honking its horn repeatedly. My first thought was that something must be wrong with my car, or maybe the desk had come loose in the back. Why else would someone be so insistent on getting my attention? I pulled over onto the shoulder, still thinking about mechanical problems or loose cargo. I was in my mid-20s and admittedly naive. As I got out of my car, the truck pulled up directly behind me, still flashing its lights and honking. I had walked about halfway to the back of my car when something felt wrong. Why was he still honking when I was already out of the car? Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. That's when my instincts finally kicked in. I jumped back into my car and sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. The next exit was 45 miles away, and he followed me the entire time, maintaining a steady distance behind me. I took the first exit I came to and pulled into a crowded grocery store parking lot. There was an ambulance parked at the laundromat next door, its lights flashing. I positioned my car next to it, figuring that if there was an ambulance, police officers would eventually show up. The man in the truck sat in the grocery store parking lot, watching me the entire time. For nearly an hour I sat there, afraid to leave my car, feeling foolish but terrified. Finally, he drove away. I waited another 15 minutes before continuing my journey back to Arizona, constantly checking my mirrors for any red trucks. About 5 or 6 years later, I was watching a true crime show with my husband at the time. He knew about my experience because we had been dating when it happened. A story came on about a man in a red truck who used those exact same tactics, flashing lights and honking, to get women to pull over on that same stretch of highway. He had murdered several of them. My blood ran cold as I watched the show. I realized how close I had come to becoming another victim. I've never been more grateful for that moment of clarity that told me something wasn't right and made me get back in my car. The incident taught me to always trust my instincts. Sometimes your subconscious mind picks up on danger signals before you can consciously process them. That split-second decision to return to my car likely saved my life. Looking back, I realize how many things could have gone wrong that night. I was alone on a dark highway. No cell phones back then, no way to call for help. The desk in my car would have made it impossible for me to see if someone was hiding in the back seat after a stop. I'm thankful for whatever guardian angel was watching over me that night. Now, whenever I hear stories about women traveling alone, I share my experience. I tell them to never pull over for anyone except marked police vehicles. And even then, to drive to a well-lit, populated area before stopping. Some might call it paranoid, but after my experience, I call it being prepared. I work night shifts at a nursing home in Manchester, and I think it's time I shared some of the ghostly encounters that have made my job far more interesting than I ever expected. The spirits here seem to have a particular fondness for scaring me senseless. When I first started working evenings, it began with footsteps behind me, especially when I was alone. Then they started touching me little taps on my head and shoulders that I couldn't explain. When I switched to night shifts, the activity increased, and I started seeing spirits that other night staff had reported. One night about a year ago, I was walking down a staircase when something caught my eye. To my right was a corridor that led to a dead end. As I glanced down it, I saw a figure, a woman, almost luminescent in her whiteness. She had no discernible face and long, stringy hair, and was peering out from a bathroom doorway. Though I could only see her head and upper body, the intensity of her presence was overwhelming. Despite her lack of facial features, I could feel her watching me. I turned to call for my coworkers, but when I looked back, she had vanished. Oddly enough, she doesn't frighten me as much as some of the other entities. She seems peaceful, almost curious, and I haven't seen her since that night. Then there's what the staff calls the Shadow Man. He lurks in corners and behind people, but seems particularly drawn to one of my regular coworkers, Margaret. I've only seen him once, standing near the entrance. We both froze like actors in a paused film before he dissolved into the darkness. One night, Margaret and I were cleaning the corridor where the resident lounges are located. We were having a bit of a rant about work stuff, nothing unusual. Suddenly, all the lounges started making loud noises simultaneously. I felt brave or stupid and told them to shut up. When I turned away, Margaret whispered that the Shadow Man was right behind me. I didn't look, but the noises quieted down. When we resumed our complaints, the racket started again. The incidents kept piling up. Once I heard a man shouting, "Help me," in a corridor filled with sleeping female residents. Another time, all the cutlery in the kitchen started rattling while I was walking out. We often see people sitting in chairs in our peripheral vision, but when we turn to look properly, the seats are empty. The whistling is particularly unnerving. It happens so close to us that we can feel the air move. But we've learned to pretend we don't hear it because acknowledging it feels wrong somehow. Once, while I was alone in the staff room, something whispered my name right in my ear. In the laundry room, I often hear the sound of walking frames moving in the corridor, even though all residents are asleep. One night, we heard screaming upstairs, But every time we went to investigate, the sound would move to the opposite end of the building. We'd rush there, only to hear it coming from where we'd just been. Another time, around 5 in the morning, we heard the distinct sound of a walking stick tapping down the corridor. We checked, but all residents were sound asleep. During one shift, while helping a resident, my coworker and I started hearing banging noises. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was my imagination, but it kept getting louder. We passed the bathroom where I'd seen the white figure months before, and suddenly the door started violently shaking and banging. We ran back down the corridor, knowing all residents were accounted for and all alarms were active on doors. To this day, I don't know what was in that bathroom. Perhaps the most chilling incident happened when my coworker and I were doing our hourly checks. We started hearing a woman's voice repeatedly calling, "Help me, help me." At first, we thought it was a resident and rechecked every room, but everyone was asleep. As we listened more closely, we realized we didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't any of our residents. I left the nursing home temporarily a few months ago, but can return anytime. I'm not sure if I want to. The spirits seem particularly active during night shifts, and they know my name. I've often wondered about their awareness. Do they know they're deceased? Do they realize time has passed? Are they former residents or something else entirely? What makes it especially unnerving is that they seem to specifically target night staff. Maybe it's because we're more vulnerable then, or maybe they're simply more active in the darkness. Either way, working nights at the nursing home has given me a unique perspective on the thin line between our world and whatever lies beyond. I saw something during the Arctic blast that hit Nebraska last winter that I still can't explain. We had temperatures dropping to negative 30 degrees for a week during what meteorologists called a polar vortex. This encounter happened right after that intense cold snap, when temperatures were still bitterly cold. My backyard has an elevated deck that overlooks several neighboring properties. Around 2 in the morning, I had just finished watching a movie and decided to have one last cigarette before bed. The night was eerily still, with temperatures hovering around negative 10 degrees. The moment I stepped outside, I heard an unusual scratching and banging noise. Looking over toward my neighbor's property 2 houses down, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. There was this strange humanoid creature with light gray skin, moving around on all fours. It was trying to get into my neighbor's garage, alternating between attempting to lift the door and wedging itself underneath. From my elevated position, I could tell that if it stood upright, the thing must have been at least 5 to 6 feet tall. I stood frozen, watching it for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 60 seconds or so. Then I quickly went back inside and locked the door. I couldn't help myself. I had to keep watching. Peering through my window, I continued observing as it manipulated the garage door. After another minute of struggling, the creature suddenly slammed itself against the door and then scuttled away. The way it moved was unlike anything I'd ever seen, almost crab-like in its movements, but with an unnatural fluidity. I'm generally skeptical about paranormal phenomena, but this thing was undeniably real. I was completely sober, and the lighting from the street lamps was good enough to see its features clearly. The creature's skin had an almost translucent quality in the artificial light, and its movements were too fluid, too precise to be someone in a costume. What strikes me most in retrospect was its deliberate behavior. It wasn't acting feral or aggressive. It seemed to be methodically testing the garage door, as if it had a specific purpose in mind. The temperature that night was dangerously cold, enough to cause frostbite in minutes. Yet this thing moved about as if completely unaffected by the extreme cold. I've lived in this neighborhood for years and never seen anything like it before or since. The polar vortex created conditions we rarely see in Nebraska. Perhaps the extreme cold brought something out of hiding, something that normally stays well away from human habitation. I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Could it have been a person suffering from hypothermia, acting erratically? But that wouldn't explain the gray skin, the unnatural movements, or how it could function in such extreme cold without any protection. Maybe it was some kind of animal, but no local wildlife matches what I saw, and its movements were too calculated, too purposeful. I still catch myself looking out toward that garage when I'm having my evening cigarette, wondering if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I don't, but another part of me wants confirmation that what I saw was real. Whatever it was, it served as a reminder that there are things in this world that defy our understanding. Things that perhaps only show themselves when conditions are just right, or just wrong enough. I was 6 or 7 years old when this happened, and even though it's been years, the memory remains crystal clear. My mother was struggling with addiction at the time, barely taking care of me. Looking back, my awareness and understanding of things might not have been complete, but the terror of that night is something I'll never forget. It was the early 90s, on a particularly cold evening. My mother and I were on an unexpected car ride. I wasn't sure why we were driving, but it was very late. I remember being half asleep in the back seat, not even recalling how I got into the car. My mother pulled up to a dilapidated house in a part of town I didn't recognize. She left me in the car, disappearing inside for what felt like forever. I dozed off, only to be violently awakened by the car door being yanked open. Someone grabbed my arm roughly and pulled me out of the car. I started screaming and crying until the man who grabbed me looked me directly in the eyes. His face was inches from mine as he growled, "Be quiet and don't try to run, or I'll kill you." He had a scruffy red beard and wild eyes that reflected pure malice. I was petrified with fear, so I obeyed. He held my arm in a vice-like grip, slammed the car door, and started walking with me down the street. I kept looking back at the house where my mother was, desperately hoping she would emerge and save me. I watched that house get smaller and smaller as the man dragged me away, my hope diminishing with each step. As we walked down the street, I wanted to cry but was too shocked and scared. If I even sniffled, the man would tighten his grip and snarl at me. I can't adequately describe the confusion and terror coursing through my small body. We walked for what seemed like miles before reaching a housing project. Rows of identical buildings crammed together in a rundown neighborhood. The man forced me up several flights of stairs. My legs and feet were aching, but I was too terrified to complain. That's when my guardian angel appeared in the form of a stranger, smoking a cigarette in the stairwell. What happened next was so fast, I barely had time to process it. Without warning, my kidnapper was suddenly on the ground. The cigarette-smoking man had launched himself at my captor, delivering a brutal series of punches and kicks to his head and face. The scene turned violent quickly. My kidnapper lay unconscious as the cigarette man grabbed him by his jacket and threw him down the stairs. The sound of his body tumbling down those steps still haunts my nightmares. Blood spattered everywhere. The cigarette man started pacing, swearing to himself, gritting his teeth and clenching his fists. His agitation terrified me, and I began to cry. He looked at me and barked, okay, shut up. His tone was harsh, but different from my kidnappers, more frustrated than threatening. He began questioning me rapidly. Why was I out so late? Where were my parents? Why would I talk to strangers? I was too shocked and confused to answer coherently. I managed to tell him a broken version of what happened, mentioning a house with Christmas lights despite the holiday being over. Somehow, from my fragmented description, he figured out where I needed to go. He seemed to know the area well. He agreed to take me back, but made me promise repeatedly that I wouldn't tell the police about seeing him or anyone who looked like him. His agitation was obvious, but I didn't care. I just wanted to return to my mother. As we descended the stairs, we had to step over my unconscious kidnapper, still bleeding at the bottom. For all I know, he might have been dead. My rescuer looked around nervously outside, telling me the police didn't like him. We walked quickly through the projects, my feet still hurting. When I started crying again, he asked what was wrong. Through tears, I told him my feet hurt. He sighed in annoyance, then awkwardly picked me up. Suddenly, he swore and ran behind a building as a police car drove past. He put me down and told me to run to the police car, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough, and the car drove away. He kept swearing to himself as he picked me up again and ran through the streets, hiding behind houses whenever police cars passed. Finally, we saw my mother's car in the distance, surrounded by police officers. My rescuer put me down and told me to run to the police. He disappeared into the night as I ran toward the flashing lights and my mother's embrace. The police asked questions, but my mother told some convoluted story that made no sense. She instructed me to stay quiet, and I did, though I couldn't stop crying. Days later, my father picked me up and somehow knew something was wrong. I told him everything. I never lived with my mother again. Years later, discussing this with my father, he shared his theory. While my mother was on a drug binge, I was kidnapped. Someone saved me, but that person had outstanding warrants. He wasn't angry at me. He was just frustrated with the situation. Imagine being a wanted criminal and suddenly having to deal with a kidnapped child and a severely beaten man. With my mother's lies and my shock-induced confusion, I wouldn't have been able to tell the police that the man had helped me. At the time, I didn't even realize he was saving me. I was too terrified by everything happening around me. To this day, I'm grateful to that anonymous criminal who, despite his own circumstances, chose to save a frightened child. As for the man who tried to kidnap me, I hope we never meet again. This happened just last December in Seattle's Northgate district. It's not necessarily creepy in a supernatural way. but it was definitely unsettling enough to make me question my safety during routine shopping trips. Being European and visiting my boyfriend in America, I had developed quite an obsession with Target. We would often visit the store near his apartment, which was located in a relatively safe, well-populated area. I never expected to feel threatened there, but here we are. One afternoon, we were walking from the parking lot toward the store entrance when I noticed a man standing near the doors. Generally, I don't think much about people hanging around store entrances. They're usually waiting for rides or finishing phone calls. But something about this particular man set off immediate alarm bells. He was watching everyone who passed by with an unnervingly intense focus. What really unsettled me was how his gaze lingered on my boyfriend and me just a bit too long. As we walked past him, I caught a glimpse of him following us in my peripheral vision. Being naturally observant and having dealt with creeps before, I'm always aware of my surroundings. I tried to subtly glance over my shoulder to confirm my suspicion, and sure enough, there he was, not even 10 feet behind us. My boyfriend remained completely oblivious to the situation. I didn't want to worry him without being absolutely certain of the threat. So I started suggesting we visit different aisles to test my theory. Every time I looked around, there was our shadow, just standing there staring at me. The most disturbing part was his expression, a strange, knowing smirk that made my skin crawl. I kept testing my theory until he suddenly vanished. Thinking I was just being paranoid, I suggested we grab drinks from the in-store Starbucks before leaving. I kept scanning the store, but saw no sign of him. We got our drinks and headed toward the exit, feeling relieved. That's when I saw him again, just waiting there by the doors. The moment he spotted us, that same unsettling smirk spread across his face, and he began following us to the parking lot. At this point, I quietly told my boyfriend, "Someone has been following us since we walked in." I lost him in the store, but he was waiting by the exit. He's right behind us now. Don't make it obvious, just get to the car and lock it as fast as you can. My boyfriend glanced back and immediately saw what I meant. The man was following uncomfortably close behind us. When we reached our car, my boyfriend quickly unlocked the doors, and we jumped in, immediately hitting the locks. The man just stood behind our car, staring through the back window, his smirk never wavering. Then he simply walked away as if nothing had happened. The strangest part, when we pulled out of the parking spot mere seconds later, he had completely vanished. It was as if he disappeared into thin air. We couldn't spot him anywhere in the vicinity. I've never been so paranoid in my life. What if he had gotten into another car and followed us home? The drive back was tense, with constant checks of the rearview mirror. When we finally arrived home, everything seemed oddly normal, except for my racing heart. I still don't understand what his intentions were. Was he planning something more sinister? Was he just trying to intimidate us? Or was he possibly mentally ill? The incident has definitely changed how I approach shopping. I'm now much more careful about who might be watching or following, even in supposedly safe places. What bothers me most is the calculated nature of his behavior. The waiting, the following, the disappearing and reappearing. It wasn't random or impulsive. He knew exactly what he was doing, and that makes it all the more terrifying. To this day, I'm grateful we noticed him and took precautions. Who knows what might have happened if we hadn't? In January 2011, my then boyfriend and I flew from Melbourne to New York City for his 21st birthday. We were both excited. Neither of us had ever been overseas before. We arrived at JFK around 10:30 at night, exhausted from the long flight. While waiting for our luggage at the carousel, we heard repeated announcements warning passengers to only use official yellow cabs and not to accept rides from unmarked vehicles. As we collected our bags and headed for the exits, a man in what appeared to be a driver's uniform approached us, asking if we needed a ride. Being tired and naive, we said yes. He took my suitcase and started walking, not toward the line of yellow cabs, but across the street toward a dark parking lot. My stomach dropped as I watched him pass all the legitimate taxis. We followed hesitantly, mainly because he had my luggage. The man stopped at a black BMW and said, "Don't worry, baby, I'm legit." At that moment, I grabbed my bag and we bolted out of there, running straight to an official taxi. The legitimate cab driver, upon hearing our story, shook his head and said, "Yeah, you were either about to get kidnapped or murdered. You've got to be careful out here." But this isn't actually the main story I want to tell. This is about what happened several years earlier, when I was living in Frankfurt, Germany. This experience demonstrated how denial and shock can make people react in the strangest ways to traumatic situations. My friend Rachel was married to Thomas, and they lived in a beautiful modern apartment in the city center. One January morning, she was alone at home while Thomas was at work. Around 11 a.m., a maintenance worker knocked on their door, saying he needed to check the heating system. Rachel, being cautious, asked for identification. He showed her what appeared to be a legitimate work ID and mentioned that several other apartments in the building had already been checked. She let him in, but stayed close by as he worked. Suddenly, he grabbed her from behind and held a knife to her throat. What followed was a horrific 2-hour ordeal that I won't detail here. Eventually, he left, taking her wedding ring and some cash. Rachel, in shock, spent an hour cleaning the apartment and taking a shower before calling the police. When Thomas came home that evening, Rachel was sitting on the couch, eerily calm. She had already given her statement to the police and undergone a medical examination. Thomas looked around the spotless apartment and asked how her day was. "I had a rough day," she said quietly. Someone broke in. Thomas, immediately concerned, asked if anything was stolen. "My wedding ring," she replied, "and some money from your drawer." "I'm sorry." Thomas hugged her and said they could get a new ring, not to worry about it. Then he noticed the cat hadn't been fed. "Oh," said Rachel, "I haven't fed her. I was busy cleaning after the man left." "What man?" Thomas asked, still not grasping the situation. "The one who pretended to be maintenance. The one who held me at knife point." Thomas froze. Finally, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. He asked why she hadn't called him immediately. "I needed to clean first," she said, as if it was the most logical thing in the world. "And I didn't want to bother you at work." This exchange haunts me to this day. Two people, both in such deep shock that they had an almost normal conversation about something so horrifically abnormal. Thomas not comprehending the magnitude of what happened until the very end. Rachel calmly apologizing for losing her wedding ring, while glossing over her traumatic experience. The human mind works in mysterious ways when dealing with trauma. Sometimes we focus on small, manageable details to avoid confronting the larger horror. Rachel fixated on cleaning the apartment and the lost ring rather than processing her attack. Thomas initially processed only the burglary aspect, his mind protecting him from the fuller, more terrible truth. This story has always reminded me that trauma responses aren't always what we expect. Sometimes they're quiet conversations about lost jewelry and unfed cats, while the real horror lies just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. This happened to me and my best friend Marcus about 15 years ago in Vancouver. Through the dense stretch of woods behind our apartment complex, there was a neighborhood of single-family homes, typical suburban cul-de-sacs, middle-class Canadian living. Except this neighborhood was completely abandoned. It was around 2008, and the effects of the global financial crisis were in full swing. A developer had bought the entire neighborhood with plans to demolish it and build luxury condos. They'd even constructed a fancy new access road from the main street. But money ran dry before the demolition could begin. Like many projects during that time, it just stopped. There was nothing in the immediate area. No shops, no gas stations, just empty houses frozen in time. Being young and adventurous, with irregular hours from our retail jobs, Marcus and I would often explore this abandoned neighborhood. A short path through the woods led to the main street, which started as gravel and transformed into asphalt toward the newer section with larger houses. We'd walk up and down the streets, chatting and occasionally sharing a joint, just being young and carefree. One of the properties had a few acres of land, with a large field where we'd sometimes bring blankets and lay out under the stars. On this particular day, the sun was shining brilliantly, probably late summer or early fall. Despite the neighborhood's eerie atmosphere, we felt safe in the daylight. We were on one of our usual walks when we saw a car on the street ahead, a small blue hatchback. This was the first vehicle we'd ever seen there. We couldn't get a good look at the driver's face, but we saw two people inside. The driver was male, white, with brown hair, wearing a blue and white raglan shirt. The car rumbled past us on the gravel road and disappeared. A few minutes later, it returned from the direction it had gone, passing us from behind. The car drove out of sight over a small hill, and we figured they'd probably gotten lost, since there was obviously nothing of interest here except abandoned houses. We continued walking for another couple of minutes. When we reached the hill's crest, we saw the car stopped on the road ahead, just sitting there with its brake lights on. That's when I noticed the passenger was gone. I started questioning whether I'd imagined seeing a second person, until Marcus said, "Wasn't there another person in that car?" My internal alarm bells started ringing, and I began to feel deeply uneasy about the situation. There was nothing behind us where they could have dropped off their passenger. The car just sat there idling, as if waiting for us. I don't know how long we stood frozen, staring at this car, possibly with its accomplice somewhere behind us, but it felt like an eternity. I had a cold, heavy feeling in my stomach. Marcus and I were both rooted to the spot, the hair on our necks standing up, mental alarm bells screaming. It dawned on me that no one knew where we were. While I stood there frozen in fear, calculating how long it would be until someone noticed we were missing, the car suddenly started backing up toward us. As the car accelerated backward, Marcus and I snapped out of our paralysis. We bolted through the backyard of an abandoned house, crashing through the woods until we emerged on the other side of our apartment complex. We ran like hell until we reached our building, constantly looking back to ensure we weren't being followed. I have no idea what those people's intentions were, where their passenger disappeared to, or why they were there. But something about the way that car just sat there, engine running, waiting for us, still sends chills down my spine years later. Looking back, the whole scene feels like something out of a horror movie. The abandoned neighborhood, the mysterious car, the vanishing passenger. The calculated nature of it all suggests this wasn't random. They chose that location specifically because it was isolated and empty. I still sometimes think about what might have happened if we hadn't trusted our instincts and run. To this day, I can't drive past an abandoned neighborhood without remembering that car and its missing passenger, waiting in the middle of nowhere on what should have been just another carefree afternoon. This ongoing nightmare started 2 years ago and still hasn't ended. I'm 26, 4'8", and often get mistaken for being much younger. After breaking up with my boyfriend during my final year of information systems studies, I decided to stay single until graduation. Like many people post-breakup, I turned to the internet for connection. I found a gaming community on Discord where I felt like I belonged. Everyone was friendly, and I enjoyed the casual flirting in the chat. That's where I met Victor. Things started innocently enough. We flirted in the group chat, and he seemed mysterious, which attracted me. He never shared photos of himself or personal details like his age. During his birthday celebration in the server, I wanted to do something special, but was limited in options. In a moment of impulsivity that I've regretted ever since, I sent him a private photo with "Happy Birthday Victor" written on it. That split-second decision changed my life completely. Within a week of constant messaging, Victor was already professing his love. He worked as a truck driver, but was temporarily off work due to a knee injury, which allowed him to message me constantly. The first red flags appeared early, but I ignored them. Our first fight erupted because I texted while driving. He completely lost control, behaving irrationally over something relatively minor. I found myself apologizing repeatedly, trying to calm him down. Months passed, and the fights became more frequent. He suggested we install a location-sharing app called Guardian to feel more connected. In my naive, love-struck state, I agreed. The app that was supposed to help us feel closer became his tool for control. Victor's true nature emerged gradually. He would break up with me publicly in our gaming server just because I flirted with another player. He threatened to share my address with strangers and make me pay for disrespecting him. During our fights, he would say things like, "I wish you would drive off a cliff and die." That's when I met Alexander through the same server. He initially reached out as a concerned friend during one of Victor's public meltdowns. Alexander was successful, mature, and seemed to genuinely care. But he too had his demons. Alexander never showed his real face. The photos he shared looked different each time, and his stories became increasingly disturbing. He would tell me about his violent fantasies, referring to himself as Mr. Wolf and describing how he wanted to breed me. He claimed to have connections with powerful people and access to private information. He would send me photos of million-dollar properties, telling me how he could convert the sellers into dungeons. He talked about watching women in our gaming community, describing how those who deceived their husbands needed to be dealt with. Both men know my address, phone number, and email. Victor has created multiple accounts to contact me when blocked. Once he even traced my new phone number just to ask me to unblock him. Now Victor tells me I should move on because he'll never change, and I'm starting to believe him. Alexander continues to send messages about wanting to kidnap me and breed me in front of Victor. They both clearly have serious issues that terrify me. I'm trapped in this situation, partially because of my own naivety and partially because of their persistence. Victor knows my schedule, my routines, my life. Alexander claims to have friends in my area and wants me to join him on a tour to meet them once his lawsuit settlement comes through. I'm hoping once I graduate and start my hospital job, I can find someone normal to date. But for now, I feel stuck. Making a clean break seems impossible when they have so much personal information about me. Every time I block Victor, he finds a new way to contact me. Alexander's messages become increasingly disturbing. The most frightening part is that these men could be completely different from how they present themselves online. Their inconsistent photos and stories suggest they're hiding their true identities. What if they're even more dangerous than they appear? Looking back, I see how a single impulsive decision led me into this nightmare. I'm sharing this story as a warning. Be careful what personal information you share online, even if someone seems trustworthy. The internet makes it easy for predators to hide their true nature. And once they have your information, it's nearly impossible to escape their reach. This happened just 2 nights ago during Thanksgiving weekend. I had gone to see a movie with my family and arrived back at my house around midnight. I live alone in a converted Victorian house that's been divided into 3 apartments, 1 upstairs and 2 downstairs. My unit is in the back, accessible through a covered porch after walking up the driveway. After getting home, I sat in my bedroom doing about 20 minutes of work on my computer. During this time, the house was completely quiet except for a man's voice continuously talking. Now my upstairs neighbor is male, and I know his bedroom is directly above mine because I previously lived in that unit. The voice sounded like someone on the phone, so I assumed it was him. I tried to focus on the voice and figure out where exactly it was coming from, but I couldn't pinpoint it. Something worth noting is that my bedroom has a door connecting to the porch, which I keep blocked with a heavy dresser. There's a main door inside the porch that serves as the primary entrance, but this strange secondary door has always made me uneasy. The voice was firm and continuous, but I couldn't make out any words. I figured it had to be my neighbor upstairs. It was the only logical explanation. Still, something felt off. I'd never heard any voices through that ceiling before. The building's insulation is quite good. After about 30 minutes of computer work, I got up to brush my teeth, feed my fish, and get ready for bed. I returned to my room, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. Keep in mind, it had been about 45 to 60 minutes since I first heard the voice, and I could still hear it. 3 minutes after lying down, I suddenly heard my porch door creaking along with the talking. The door has a very distinctive sound that I immediately recognized. I crept across my dark room and put my ear to the dresser, blocking the porch door. Sure enough, the talking was coming from inside my porch, and I could hear the door moving and shuffling. My heart dropped. All the lights were off in my house at this point, giving me a slight advantage as I crept down my hallway. I peered into the kitchen, which the porch leads into. Through the door and in a streak of moonlight, I saw a man with long, scraggly hair sitting curled up in the center of my porch, turned away from me, muttering to himself and rocking back and forth. Fight or flight kicked in, and I immediately ripped open the door, screaming at him to get out. Looking back, I probably should have armed myself first, but adrenaline took over. The man didn't even react to my sudden appearance and screaming. He simply turned his head slightly to the side, never showing his face, and said in an eerily calm voice, "My name is Ethan." This response terrified me more than if he had yelled back. He still hadn't turned around or shown his face. I kept cursing at him to leave, and he slowly rose with his hands up, saying, I know, I'm hiding." His tone wasn't pleading, it was almost playful, which made it even more disturbing. I chased him out of the porch, still threatening him. I assumed he was homeless and possibly under the influence, as I live in an urban area where this isn't uncommon. But something about his behavior, the way he sat there for at least an hour, his refusal to show his face, that childlike, mysterious tone made this encounter particularly unsettling. I was in full defense mode by the time I opened that door, running purely on adrenaline. No imaginable situation would justify someone being in my porch at that hour, talking to themselves. The fact that he had been there for at least an hour while I sat nearby, completely unaware, still sends chills down my spine. Now I'm religious about checking my porch lock every night. It's ironic because having my bedroom connected to the porch, I've always had this intrusive fear that I'd hear someone out there one night. Looks like that fear became reality. So please, Ethan, if that's even your name, let's never meet again. The memory of your voice, your refusal to show your face, and the knowledge that you sat there watching my home for so long is more than enough for one lifetime. When I was 19 and serving in the Navy, I made what I now recognize as a series of naive decisions that could have ended tragically. Using my military benefits, I had secured a home loan and bought my first house, a modest single-story, in a quiet neighborhood near the base. I moved in with just the basics from my barracks room and gradually started furnishing the place. A few bar stools, a futon to sleep on until I could afford a proper bed, and some second-hand coffee tables for my TV. My German Shepherd, Max, was my only companion in this new space. One afternoon, while unpacking boxes in the living room, I noticed a car pull into my driveway, blocking me in. A man stepped out wearing khakis and a polo shirt with a company logo and name tag. He introduced himself as a home security system representative. Though his car had no corporate markings. Looking back, this should have been my first red flag, but I assumed some salespeople used personal vehicles. He launched into a friendly pitch about home security systems, emphasizing how I could monitor my house's exterior from anywhere. Being a low-ranking service member, I knew I couldn't afford another monthly payment, but I was raised to be polite, maybe too polite. Years in customer service had taught me to be respectful of people doing their jobs. I tried declining after he showed me some features on his tablet, but he was persistent. Then came the questions, the kind that should have set off alarm bells. "Do you live alone?" I lied, saying I lived with my wife and our 3 large dogs. In reality, it was just Max and me, but something made me want to appear less vulnerable. When he asked about my current security system, I mentioned my dog and my military training. Looking back, I shouldn't have revealed my service status. He seemed surprised but undeterred, repeatedly asking to come inside to show me the best places for cameras. The entire interaction lasted about 15 minutes, with me becoming increasingly uncomfortable while trying to maintain politeness. Finally, at my wit's end with social niceties, I simply walked away, leaving him standing in my front yard. He got in his car and left. I tried to shake off the encounter and went about unpacking. After setting up the futon with my favorite blankets, I made sure all doors and windows were locked. For context, my back door was a double glass pane door. I hadn't installed curtains yet, but there were blinds on the kitchen window. The kitchen, living room, and dining room were all connected, but I had positioned my futon against a wall where it couldn't be seen from either the back doors or the front door window. Around 11 that night, Max got up from the futon and went to the back doors. He wasn't normally a barker, usually greeting strangers with a wagging tail. But this time he started whining, which evolved into a growl I'd never heard before. It sent terror straight through me. I sat frozen in the dark, my heart pounding. The growl wasn't just aggressive. It was a warning of immediate danger. I wanted to hide or call the police, but I realized anyone outside would see my phone's light and know exactly where I was. While Max maintained his position at the back door, I talked myself into investigating. Still terrified, I crept to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. Squatting among the cabinets to stay hidden from any windows, I gathered my courage to peek through the blinds. There in my backyard was the security system salesman, standing near my porch. He wasn't trying to hide, he was just standing there, watching my house. My heart nearly stopped. This was no longer about making a sale. This was predatory behavior. I jumped up quickly, climbed over the counter, and started turning on every light in the house. I moved toward the back door, ready to let Max loose, hoping he would at least scare the man away. The moment the lights came on, the man sprinted to the lower part of my fence and disappeared into the night. I didn't sleep that night. Max sat with me on the futon, calm as could be, having done his job. The next morning, I filed a police report and learned that legitimate salespeople are required to carry proper identification and permits. The police increased patrols in the area, and I later discovered that several other young service members had reported similar suspicious visits. That night I had 2 friends stay over, ready for the man's possible return. He never came back, but the incident changed me forever. I became much more security conscious, and installed a proper alarm system within the week. The experience taught me that politeness should never override our instincts about danger. Now, years later, I still wonder what might have happened if Max hadn't been there, or if I had let the man inside during his sales pitch. Sometimes the scariest realizations are the what-ifs that follow a close call. In early 2014, when I was 18, I made a series of dangerously naive decisions that could have ended tragically. I had just started taking night classes for my GED, and my curiosity led me to browse various online classifieds. I responded to an advertisement that, in retrospect, should have raised numerous red flags. I began texting with someone who claimed to be named Isabella. Being 18 and completely unfamiliar with how these things worked, I didn't recognize the obvious signs of danger. The arrangement was to meet at a motel on the outskirts of town. In my youthful ignorance, I didn't see anything wrong with this location. Isabella mentioned something about donations, but I assumed this meant optional contributions. Again, my naivety was staggering. On the appointed evening, instead of going to my GED class as usual, I walked to the motel. It was pouring rain and unseasonably warm, so by the time I arrived, I was completely drenched in sweat and rain. I knocked on the designated room door, and a woman answered. Her appearance should have been another warning sign, but as I've mentioned, 18 and clueless. She invited me in, and I asked to use the shower quickly to clean up. As I started undressing in the bathroom, she began removing her top. I told her not to worry, that I wouldn't be long. She waited on the bed, watching some daytime talk show while I showered. When I came out with just a towel around my waist, I asked if she was ready. That's when everything changed. She sprawled out on the bed and demanded payment up front. My face must have dropped as I suddenly realized the full situation. I nervously told her I didn't have any money. She erupted, screaming and throwing my clothes and bag at me. I got dressed and actually apologized for wasting her time. As I left her room and started heading back toward my class, a green Volkswagen Beetle pulled up beside me. The driver called me over. I tried to ignore him and walk past, but he kept shouting until I approached his driver's side window. The man looked sketchy, and I quickly realized he must be Isabella's enforcer. He had his left arm resting on the car door while his right hand held something below the window line. When I got closer, I saw it was a pistol. "Why would you come here knowing you don't have any money?" he demanded. I explained as calmly as possible that I hadn't understood the situation. He raised his arm slightly to make sure I saw his gun and said, "I have messages between you and her saying you had the money." This was a lie. I had never discussed payment. The man lowered his weapon slightly and said, "You're lucky you came to one of my girls. Other girls would have stabbed you with a broken pipe. I see you're pretty young, so I'll let you off with a warning this time." He motioned for me to leave, and I did, constantly looking over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't going to shoot me from behind. As I walked away, I noticed another car pull up, clearly waiting for him. I realized they had this whole operation coordinated. I made it to my GED class, my heart still pounding. Later, I learned the motel was notorious for these kinds of operations. The police regularly conducted stings there, but the activity never stopped, it just evolved. The incident taught me several valuable lessons. First, nothing in life is free. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Second, what seems like an adventure can quickly turn into a nightmare. And third, I was incredibly lucky to walk away from that situation alive. What haunts me most isn't the gun or the threats. It's how easily I could have become another statistic. One naive decision nearly led to disaster. The coordination between the woman and the man with the gun showed this wasn't just some random operation. It was organized and dangerous. Years later, whenever I pass that motel, I still get chills. To Isabella and her gun-toting partner, let's never meet again. That one encounter was more than enough for a lifetime. My best friend Ashley and I rented our first apartment together in Portland's historic district. It was a fully furnished Victorian home, complete with dishes, linens, and everything we needed, perfect for two young women just starting out. The elderly property manager showed us around, explaining that her son owned the house but lived on the coast. The house was a 3-bedroom, but one room remained perpetually locked, allegedly used for storage. While this seemed odd, we only needed 2 bedrooms and were getting an incredible deal. Still, that locked room always felt unsettling, like it was watching us. The previous occupants seemed to have left in a hurry. We found items in the nightstands, and oddly enough, a stack of vintage magazines from the 70s hidden in my closet. The house had some peculiar features. Most of it was built on a concrete slab, but the kitchen had a slight elevation with wooden flooring that would creak when walked upon. Sometimes, lying in bed at night, I'd hear footsteps crossing that kitchen floor when I was alone. I dismissed these sounds, not wanting to frighten myself or Ashley. Then one night, while we had friends over, our friend David suddenly hushed everyone. In the silence, we all heard distinct footsteps walking across the kitchen floor. "Those sound exactly like footsteps," David said, and Ashley and I exchanged glances, finally admitting to each other that we'd both been hearing them, but had been too afraid to mention it. The next incident happened late one night as I was preparing for bed. My boyfriend occasionally stopped by after his late shift, so when I heard the distinctive buzzer doorbell ring, I assumed it was him. The sound was unmistakable, one of those old-fashioned, incredibly loud buzzers typical of older homes. I went to answer the door, but no one was there. The street stretched straight in both directions, well lit enough that I would have seen anyone leaving. I was certain I'd heard the doorbell, so my hair stood on end. Feeling suddenly alone and vulnerable, I went to wake Ashley, but she wouldn't stir no matter how hard I shook her or how loudly I called her name. This was completely unlike her. She'd never been a heavy sleeper. After trying to wake her for 15 minutes, I had to return to my room alone, pull the covers over my head like a child, and try to sleep. Later, I confirmed with my boyfriend that he hadn't come by that night. The most inexplicable event involved 3 heavy antique gardening tools mounted on the hallway wall. One day, I was in the shower when I heard a loud crash. Ashley came running in, completely freaked out. All 3 items had fallen onto the floor simultaneously. These weren't lightweight decorations. They were solid, heavy pieces that had been securely mounted. We were stuck in a lease, so we couldn't just leave. But shortly after this incident, the owner decided to sell the house. That's when things got really strange. The owner, whom we'd never met, showed up drunk one day when only Ashley was home. He made her extremely uncomfortable, and then he appeared at my workplace. He sued us, claiming we'd damaged the carpet, but we'd only lived there 6 months, and the carpet was unchanged from move-in. We had to hire a lawyer and ultimately won the case, but the whole situation felt bizarre. The house had an addition on the back, also on a concrete slab, right off the elevated kitchen. Sometimes I wondered if the owner had added it himself, and if there was some darker reason for all the strange occurrences. Looking back, several elements made the experience particularly unsettling. The locked room that we never saw inside. The previous occupants' belongings left behind, as if they'd fled. The owner's erratic behavior. The connection between the paranormal activity and the kitchen floor, which seemed somehow different from the rest of the house. We never discovered what was really happening in that house, but the combination of supernatural occurrences and the owner's disturbing behavior suggested something sinister. Perhaps the spirits were trying to warn us about something or someone. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some doors are better left locked. In the summer of 2023, I made what now seems like a foolishly brave decision. As a 19-year-old hiking enthusiast from Western Ukraine, I decided to embark on a solo overnight camping trip in the Carpathian Mountains, near Mount Haverla. The trail I chose was a hidden gem, unmarked on most maps and rarely traveled. I'd hiked it twice before with my grandfather, who taught me everything I know about mountain survival. The location was perfect for what I had in mind, camping in a restricted area where the Park Service had explicitly forbidden overnight stays. The isolation was exactly what attracted me. In all my previous visits, we hadn't encountered a single other hiker. The trail wound through ancient beech forests, past forgotten meadows, and alongside crystal-clear mountain streams. I wasn't unprepared for the adventure. My backpack contained 3 different knives, including my grandfather's old hunting blade, a high-pitched whistle to ward off wolves, and enough experience to feel confident in my abilities. My father dropped me off at the trailhead early in the morning, giving me plenty of time to reach my intended camping spot before dusk. The hike itself was magnificent. The summer air was filled with the sweet scent of wild thyme and mountain flowers. I took my time, photographing interesting mushrooms and collecting wild blueberries along the way. As the sun began its descent, I arrived at my chosen campsite, a small clearing nestled between ancient beech trees, just off the main trail. While setting up my tent, I discovered something intriguing, the crumbling remains of what appeared to be an old shepherd's hut. The stone foundation was mostly covered in moss, but you could still make out the basic square shape. Local legends spoke of these mountains harboring ancient secrets, but I was too focused on setting up camp to give it much thought. I prepared a simple dinner using my portable gas stove, careful not to start a fire that might attract attention. As darkness fell, I crawled into my tent, feeling satisfied with my little adventure. The mountain air had grown chilly, and the familiar sounds of the forest were oddly comforting. I awoke suddenly in the dead of night. At first I lay still, unsure what had disturbed my sleep. The forest was quieter than it should have been. No owls, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness. Then I heard it, A haunting melody played on what sounded like a wooden flute, coming from somewhere in the darkness. My heart began to race. The music was unlike anything I'd heard before, ancient sounding, with a melody that seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways. It wasn't some lost hiker trying to find their way. This was something else entirely. I reached for my grandfather's knife, gripping it tightly as the music grew closer. The melody stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps on dried leaves. They were moving around my tent, not directly approaching but circling, as if studying my presence. I remained absolutely still, barely breathing, my hand clutching the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate marks being carved into the tree nearest my tent. The sound was methodical, almost ritualistic. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the footsteps retreated into the forest, accompanied by one final, discordant note from the flute. I didn't sleep a wink after that. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, I practically threw my gear into my backpack. It wasn't until I was almost finished packing that I noticed them strange symbols carved into several trees surrounding my campsite. They looked ancient, yet the cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still light against the dark bark. I ran most of the way back to the trailhead, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached the pickup point where my father was waiting, I was drenched in sweat despite the morning chill. To this day, I haven't returned to that trail, and I've never told the Park Service about my illegal camping trip. Sometimes, when I'm hiking other trails, I catch myself listening for that otherworldly flute music, hoping I'll never hear it again. Looking back, I realize the locals might have had good reasons for their superstitions about these mountains. Some places, perhaps, are forbidden for a reason. A lesson I learned the hard way that night in the Carpathians. I'm a 32-year-old photographer who specializes in night sky imagery. Last autumn, I traveled to the painted deserts of Arizona to capture the Milky Way. Given my specific focus on dark sky photography, I needed a location far from any light pollution. After extensive research, I found this remote ranch that bordered Saguaro National Park, perfect for capturing the desert's starlit majesty. I contacted the owner through their website and paid to camp on their land. The property was incredibly isolated. You had to navigate several unmarked desert roads just to reach it. When I finally arrived, the landscape took my breath away. Towering saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels against the backdrop of rust-colored cliffs. My camping spot was at the edge of the property, where the ranch's boundaries merged with the national park. Everything to my right melted into the Rincon Mountain District, a vast expanse of pristine desert wilderness. After setting up my tent and equipment, I spent several hours capturing the sunset, watching as the desert transformed from vibrant oranges to deep purples. Just before heading to bed, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravelly desert soil. Given how remote the location was, I initially assumed it was some nocturnal desert wildlife, perhaps a coyote or javelina. I tucked myself into my sleeping bag, but was soon awakened around 3:45 in the morning by more sounds. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, as the night had been eerily still until then. But then I heard more deliberate movement, maybe 4 distinct footsteps. Just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I saw a flash outside my tent. My first rational thought was that perhaps the ranch had some sort of monitoring equipment on the rock formations. Maybe motion sensor cameras that periodically activated. I tried to fall back asleep, but another flash lit up the night, this time much closer and far more intense. Let me be clear, this wasn't just any kind of light. It was exactly like a professional camera flash, with that distinctive double burst pattern and the concentrated center of light that then spreads outward. And I would know. I've been working with camera equipment for over a decade. For the next 2.5 hours, this flash circled my tent, appearing from different angles. Sometimes it was right against the canvas, other times more distant and diffused. What terrified me most was that I never heard any footsteps accompanying the movement of the light. In this desert environment, it would have been impossible for someone to move silently across the rocky terrain. The final straw came when a flash appeared right at my tent's entrance, as if someone had pressed their camera directly against the zipper. I should mention that my tent was made of thick, non-transparent material. Even if someone was trying to photograph me inside, they wouldn't have been able to see anything. I've spent weeks trying to find a logical explanation. Could it have been other astrophotographers? No, the cardinal rule of night sky photography is no artificial light, especially no flashes. Heat lightning, that would have come from above, not directly against my tent, and wouldn't have had that distinctive photographic flash pattern. The experience left me deeply unsettled. These days, I only do my night photography from the safety of my car. I never returned to that ranch, but my camera mysteriously stopped working shortly after that night, despite being relatively new. When I took it in for repairs, the technician said the sensor was completely fried, as if it had been exposed to an impossibly intense burst of light. As I plan my future photography trips, I find myself drawn to the mountains. Something about the vast, empty desert no longer calls to me the way it used to. Perhaps some lights are better left uncaptured. There are things in the darkness that don't want their picture taken. This experience shook me to my core, and even now, 5 years later, I still get chills thinking about it. I was 14 at the time, living in Poland, when my family decided to take a vacation to Greece, specifically to the historic city of Thessaloniki. The city was beautiful, with its ancient architecture and vibrant culture. But what happened there would haunt me forever. On our third day, we joined a guided tour group to explore the city. The final stop was the famous Modiano Market, a historic covered marketplace where you could find everything from fresh produce to handcrafted goods. The atmosphere was electric, the smell of spices, the sound of merchants calling out their wares, the colorful displays of local crafts. While exploring with my father, I spotted a beautiful handmade leather bracelet at one of the stalls. The vendor, a middle-aged man with weathered skin and calculating eyes, came over as I admired it. He explained its craftsmanship in detail, showing how each piece was hand-stitched. I asked my father if I could buy it, as I didn't have my own money at that age. He suggested we look around more first, to make sure there weren't other options I might prefer. We continued exploring the market, looking at various stalls. but I kept thinking about that bracelet. When we had about 15 minutes left before our tour group was set to leave, we headed back to the stall. My father had stepped away momentarily to respond to a message from my mother, leaving me alone at the stall. I noticed the bracelet wasn't where it had been earlier. I asked the vendor if it was still available. His demeanor had changed completely. There was something unsettling in his eyes now. He said yes, and told me to come to the back of the stall to look at it. There was a small door beside the counter, leading to what appeared to be a storage room. Despite everything I'd been taught about stranger danger, especially in a foreign country, I made the terrible decision to follow him. The moment I stepped inside, he shut and locked the door behind me, plunging me into complete darkness. The reality of what was happening hit me like a wave of ice water. I started banging on the door and shouting, but he responded with threats that made my blood run cold. His words were so horrifying that I can't bring myself to repeat them, even now. I kept screaming for my father, pounding on the door with all my might. The vendor banged back on the door, ordering me to be quiet. Just as despair was starting to overwhelm me, I heard my father shouting my name. What followed was a heated exchange between him and the vendor. I couldn't understand most of it through the door, but my father later told me he had threatened to tear the entire stall apart if I wasn't released immediately. The door suddenly flew open with tremendous force. My father stood there, looking both terrified and furious. He grabbed me and lifted me up, something he rarely did anymore, and we quickly left the market. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if my father hadn't heard my screams. We reported the incident to the local police and our tour company, but I'm not sure what came of it. The terror of those few minutes in that dark room has stayed with me. Sometimes, when I'm in crowded markets or small spaces, I can still feel that same panic rising in my chest. My father and I have never really talked about it since, but I notice how he always stays close when we're in crowded places now. That day taught me that evil can hide in the most colorful and vibrant places, and that a parent's love can be the difference between safety and unthinkable horror. Growing up in a late Victorian mansion in Massachusetts wasn't as glamorous as it might sound. The house, built in 1887, had a dark history that seemed to seep from its very walls. The original owner, a wealthy textile merchant, had constructed it and several other properties in the area, selling them to fund his daughter's tuberculosis treatment. According to Mrs. Abigail, the elderly neighbor who'd lived there since the 1950s, he'd grown bitter about parting with his beloved properties. The house itself was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, but beneath its ornate facade lay decades of decay. Every room harbored different types of mold: black, gray, green, even some that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly life. The spores we must have inhaled over the years make me shudder to think about now. Some of our experiences could perhaps be attributed to toxic mold exposure, but others, well, I'm not so sure. I was around 5 years old when it first happened. I was playing in my room while my mother chatted on the phone with my grandmother. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows, and I had my coloring books spread across my bed. On the floor beside me lay a small brass bell, part of an old wind chime, and a wooden toy train. That's when I saw it, a massive dark hand reaching out from under my bed. It wasn't shadowy or transparent like you might expect a ghost to be. It was solid black, like a void in the shape of a hand. I watched paralyzed as it grabbed the brass bell and tossed it, causing it to hit the toy train and knock it sideways. I screamed, not just a startled yelp, but a primal shriek that sent my mother running upstairs. She found me hyperventilating, pupils dilated to pinpoints, pointing frantically at the space under my bed. She checked, of course, but found nothing except my scattered toys. Years passed, and I managed to convince myself it had been my imagination. Then, when I was 18, something happened that shattered that comfortable denial. I was in the same room, which had remained my bedroom all those years, changing clothes for my shift at the local diner. As I turned to get a shirt from my closet, I came face to face with something. It wasn't dark this time. Instead, it was like looking at a distortion in reality, as if someone had taken a piece of the air itself and twisted it into a vaguely human shape. There was no face, no features, just that bending of space. I gasped, rooted to the spot. It vanished instantly, but the damage was done. I fled the house half-dressed, finishing getting ready in my car. After that, I developed a habit of only being home when others were there. I'd find excuses to stay at the library, local parks, anywhere else. My parents noticed this behavior separately, but we never discussed it. We all just assumed we were individually losing our minds. Finally, my mother broke the silence. "I think I might be schizophrenic," she announced one evening, "and I'm going to see a doctor." It was like a dam breaking. Suddenly, we could all talk about the things we'd seen, the experiences we'd kept secret from each other. My mother did see a doctor. She had brain scans, psychological evaluations, the works. No schizophrenia. I got checked too, nothing. We were all perfectly sane, which somehow made everything worse. The house itself seemed to react to our acknowledgement of its strangeness. Things escalated. Objects would move when we weren't looking. Cold spots appeared in the middle of summer. The mold, despite our best efforts, grew back in strange patterns that looked almost like symbols. Being a skeptic by nature, it took me years to accept what happened in that house. Even now, I struggle to talk about it. The rational part of my brain wants to find logical explanations. Toxic mold, carbon monoxide, mass hysteria. But deep down, I know what we experienced was real. Last I heard, the house had been renovated into luxury apartments. I sometimes wonder if the new residents have seen the hand reaching from under their beds, or the faceless distortion in their mirrors. Some places carry their history like a scar, visible to those who know where to look. Living in the Scottish Highlands means you get used to remote places, but some experiences still manage to shake you to your core. This happened just last month, when summer was drawing to a close. My friend Emma and I decided to take an evening drive up to the mountains. I'd grown up near the edge of the wilderness and knew these winding roads like the back of my hand. Emma was newer to the area, having only visited the mountains a few times. I wanted to show her how magical the highlands could be at night, especially when you can see all the lights of Inverness twinkling below as you descend from the foothills. I loved listening to folk horror podcasts and watching scary movies, which may have helped prepare me for what was about to happen. Or maybe it just made everything worse. We headed up in my trusted Volkswagen, a dependable old thing that had made this journey with me dozens of times before. There's a point where the pavement ends, and the gravel road takes you deeper into the mountains. Just beside this transition, there's a stretch of dirt where people often park their trucks and trailers. As we drove past, I noticed the pullout was empty, which was normal for this time of night. It was nearly 10 p.m. The sun had long since set, and the timer-controlled lights had come on in the valley below. I'd never seen any lights up in the mountains, though. Almost every farming field up here was fenced off with locked gates and signs warning private property. Most of these signs were peppered with bullet holes, a clear message from the landowners about how they felt about trespassers. Every field in the highlands is watered with center pivot irrigation systems. Those long, arched metal frames with wheels that rotate around a central point. They're a common sight throughout Scotland's agricultural districts. I'd seen a few systems in the valley that had timer-controlled lights. So at first, I wasn't too alarmed when I saw a single light in one of the fields. But then I remembered something that made my blood run cold. "Oh hell," I muttered, which probably wasn't what Emma wanted to hear during her first nighttime mountain excursion. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I know the farmers are harvesting now, but I've never seen that light before." I gestured to our right, where a solitary amber light glowed ominously at the edge of the field. The road ahead was dark enough that I could only see what my headlights illuminated, but I was familiar enough with the mountains to know that the light was in the wrong place. I started tapping nervously on the steering wheel as mixed emotions flooded through me. Part of me wanted to keep going because the mountains would be beautiful in the half-moon light, and Emma had never seen them at night before. My instincts, however, were screaming at me that something was very wrong. Emma must have sensed my unease because she asked, "Have you ever seen lights in that field before?" I explained that not only had I never seen lights there, but I'd never even seen that field farmed. We were only a quarter-mile in when I made the decision to turn around. "I'm sorry, Emma. If those were tractor headlights, we'd see two of them. And if it was someone legitimately working, they wouldn't waste energy lighting an unused field." Emma, bless her, didn't mind that we were turning around. As we approached the dirt pullout again, we were shocked to find it was no longer empty. A white pickup truck and a flatbed trailer were now parked there. 5 or 6 men were gathered around the truck, its headlights illuminating the scene. One man was quickly unloading what looked like an ATV from the trailer. Moving so fast, I thought he might crash into his companions. I sped past, my heart racing. As we passed, I saw someone run behind my car. I turned onto a road that would lead us to the main highway, pushing my speed up to 70 miles per hour. "Emma," I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "were those people there when we drove by earlier?" "No," she replied calmly, though I could hear the tension in her voice. "And did they seem to be in a hurry to you?" I pressed, watching my rearview mirror intently. "Just a bit," she laughed nervously, also checking over her shoulder. Thankfully, there was no other traffic, so we didn't have to slow down. We had 8 miles of straight, flat road, with no cover before we'd reach civilization. We drove to a crowded pub and sat in the car while we tried to calm down. We We attempted to rationalize why those men had appeared so suddenly in the middle of the night. Emma suggested they might have been helping someone broken down in the mountains. All the land up there is private property, I reminded her. Nobody camps up there, it's all fenced off. Later that night, we got a text from my friend who works for the Highland Mountain Rescue. He warned us that there had been reports of suspicious activity in that area, with several hikers reporting being followed and intimidated. I've been up those mountains countless times since then, but only in broad daylight. Whatever those men were doing up there that night, I'm glad we trusted our instincts and left before we found out. So to the men by the truck who watched us drive away, let's never meet again. A month ago, when autumn was just beginning to paint the Norwegian countryside in shades of amber and gold, my friend Astrid and I decided to try something different. Living near Oslo's outskirts, I'd grown up practically in the wilderness and was familiar with the mountain roads that snaked through the fjords. Astrid, having recently moved from the city, had only experienced these majestic landscapes a handful of times. I discovered this unique camping opportunity through a website similar to Airbnb, but specifically for outdoor enthusiasts. The property was a 100-acre farm, just 20 minutes away from where we planned to go kayaking the next day. The listing caught my eye because it boasted modern amenities, working bathrooms, showers, and permission for campfires. The crown jewel of the property was a beautifully restored 19th century barn. Among all the available sites in the area, this one had the most reviews, though only 3, all 5-star ratings. Given how remote this region was, the low number of reviews didn't raise any immediate red flags. The host, who introduced herself as Ingrid, communicated only through text messages, but seemed pleasant enough. We began our 2-hour drive later than planned, which put us behind our scheduled 11 a.m. arrival time. We kept Ingrid updated about our delay. Her only response was to let her know when we arrived at the address she provided. When we finally pulled up to the property, we were immediately struck by the barn. It was exactly as pictured, a massive traditional Norwegian structure adorned with string lights, its red-painted timber gleaming in the afternoon sun. The lights were on despite it being midday, creating an oddly festive atmosphere. We parked and texted Ingrid to announce our arrival. 10 minutes later, a weathered-looking man in his 60s arrived on an ATV. He introduced himself as Ingrid's father-in-law, explaining that she was busy with the autumn harvest. He gave us a peculiar welcome speech, telling us we could take our car anywhere on the property. There were no designated campsites. He even offered to help pull my car out if it got stuck. When we asked about cell service, he made a joke that anyone local would understand about reception being better on one side of the barn than the other. I am from the area and found it amusing, but then realized something unsettling. He didn't have the characteristic local accent that should have accompanied such a comment. After he left, we explored the property on foot. The barn was even more impressive up close. It was fully insulated and equipped with a modern kitchen. The only warning we received was not to drink the tap water. The space seemed perfect for small weddings or gatherings of around 50 people. We walked past a storage shed behind the barn to access the hiking trails that wound through the woods. After a challenging hike that convinced us my car would never manage the terrain, we decided to camp near a small stream on the opposite side of the barn. We were still within walking distance, but used my car as a buffer to create a sense of isolation. Having chosen our spot, we drove into the nearby village for dinner and a walk. We messaged Ingrid about the fire pit policy, and she replied that they would deliver one to the barn for us to take to our campsite. When we returned about 90 minutes before sunset, we noticed the barn's lights had been turned off. We assumed they were on a timer to save energy. We also noticed the fire pit hadn't been delivered yet. We commenced the grueling 30-minute tent setup in the sticky late summer heat, rewarding ourselves with a rest in the air-conditioned car afterward. Dark clouds threatened rain, so we pulled out a card game and waited for it to pass. The shower lasted only 10 minutes, but sunset was approaching rapidly. The tent had weathered the rain perfectly, so we felt comfortable leaving it to use the bathroom. As we crossed the stream, we heard what sounded like someone moving things around in the shed. Unnerved but trying to rationalize, I suggested to Astrid that maybe some equipment used earlier was just cooling down and settling. When we reached the barn, the lights were still off, but the fire pit had been delivered. We entered to check if the power was out, but none of the light switches worked. We assumed the power was cut, perhaps on the same timer as the exterior lights. We had barely walked 10 feet from the barn when we heard a distant humming sound, and suddenly the power to the barn was restored. We changed direction to use the bathroom, but the moment we stepped inside, the power cut again. An unsettling feeling crept over me, and I could tell Astrid felt it too. I nervously joked, maybe they're just watching us, then immediately added, no, that's actually much worse. We walked back outside and the lights turned on. Astrid said we needed to leave, and I felt the same primal fear rising in my chest. We returned the fire pit to its spot by the barn, and the lights began to flicker. We hurriedly walked back to camp, being careful not to run something my Norwegian grandmother had taught me about showing fear in the wilderness. The 30-minute setup became a 5-minute takedown as we packed everything into my car. Just as we started the engine, Astrid looked back and saw a figure standing by the shed, watching us. As soon as my car pulled onto the main road, we received a text from Ingrid informing us that the fire pit was by the barn. She also mentioned we were welcome to stay in the barn if the rain had affected our camping plans. We drove to the nearest hotel, willing to pay whatever it cost to feel safe. The elderly receptionist who checked us in looked shocked when we told her where we'd been. She asked if we'd seen the recent news reports. When we said we hadn't, she explained that several couples who had gone camping in the region had disappeared. 3 couples were still missing, and one had been found barely alive on the side of the highway. We checked into our room and texted Ingrid to tell her we weren't staying. "Thank you for staying with us," she responded. We double-locked our hotel room door, and I broke down in tears. That primal fight-or-flight feeling I experienced at the barn still haunts me. I feel it in my throat just writing this. To the man by the shed who watched us drive away, let's never meet. And to anyone looking for a unique camping experience in the Norwegian countryside, maybe stick to the official campgrounds. something happened last night that has shaken me more deeply than I care to admit. I live in a small cottage on the outskirts of Edinburgh, Scotland, in one of those quiet neighborhoods where most residents are retired couples and young families. Nothing ever happens here, or at least that's what I thought until last night. It was around 12:30 in the morning, and I was getting ready for bed after spending too much time watching old episodes of Doctor Who. As I was brushing my teeth, the lights flickered once and then went out completely. At first, I wasn't particularly concerned. Power cuts aren't unusual in Scottish winters, when the grid gets overloaded or a storm brings down power lines. But then I noticed something odd. My phone had stopped charging, the little LED on my surge protector wasn't blinking, and when I opened my front door to check the street, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Every other house still had power. Just mine was dark. That's when the unease started to creep in. I went back inside, double-checked all the locks, and grabbed the small camping lantern I keep in the kitchen cupboard for emergencies. I was standing in my living room, trying to decide whether to call the power company, when I heard a sound from the back of the house. It wasn't dramatic, just the soft, distinctive creak of my garden gate opening. It's an old wrought iron gate, heavy and weathered, and it has a very particular sound that I'd recognize anywhere. Here's the layout of my cottage. I have 2 doors, front and back. The back door opens onto a small garden, with the gate that leads to a narrow lane. The lane isn't lit, and you wouldn't even know the gate existed unless you'd been there before. I crept to the back door as quietly as I could, automatically reaching for the porch light switch before remembering it wouldn't work. Then came the second sound, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the gravel path, slow and deliberate, like someone trying not to make noise. I backed away from the door, grabbed my keys and phone, and slipped them into my wool cardigan pocket. I wasn't ready to call emergency services yet. I still wasn't entirely sure I wasn't just letting my imagination run wild. That's when I heard the tap on my living room window. Just one, a soft, gentle tap, like someone testing the glass. That was it. I didn't even stop to put on shoes. I ran out the front door in my slippers, jumped into my car, and drove straight to the 24-hour Tesco about 3 miles away. I stayed there until sunrise, pretending to be incredibly interested in the breakfast cereal aisle, while the night staff gave me concerned looks. When I returned home, everything appeared normal. The power was back on, the gate was closed, and there were no signs of attempted break-in. Nothing showed up on my security cameras, but here's the thing, they only record when they have power, and the power was out for exactly 43 minutes. I called Scottish Power, and they had no record of an outage at my address. Every house on my street had been fine. I called my friend who works as an electrician, and he said someone could have easily killed the power from outside by accessing the main circuit breaker. Mine's on the side of the house, completely exposed. All they'd have to do is flip the main switch, and boom, darkness. I checked the breaker box. Sure enough, the main switch had been manually turned off. Someone had deliberately cut my power. I filed a police report, but without evidence of actual damage or theft. They just logged it and told me to call back if anything else happened. Now I'm sitting here with new padlocks on my breaker box, motion-activated floodlights being installed tomorrow, and a cricket bat beside my bed. What terrifies me most isn't the thought of ghosts or demons. It's the knowledge that a person deliberately targeted my house, killed my power, and tested my windows while I was inside. Yesterday, I installed a backup battery system for my security cameras and added extra locks to all my windows. I'm looking into getting a dog, something big and loud. The police suggested I join the neighborhood watch program, which I did immediately. What keeps me up at night isn't just what happened, it's the methodical nature of it all. They knew where my breaker box was. They knew which window to test. They knew I was alone. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if they're still watching, waiting for another opportunity. I've lived in this cottage for 3 years, and I've always loved its quaint charm and peaceful setting. Now every creak makes me jump, and I find myself checking the windows constantly. I know I should probably move, but part of me refuses to be driven from my home by fear. Still, I sleep with the cricket bat within reach, and I've programmed emergency services into my speed dial. Because somewhere out there, someone knows exactly how to plunge my world into darkness. This happened about 10 years ago in the misty highlands of Western Ireland, near the Connemara Mountains. I grew up in a tiny village, the sort of place with one pub and more sheep than people. If you've ever driven through County Galway's remote areas, you know the atmosphere. Ancient stone walls cutting through emerald hills, abandoned railway tracks that still carry cargo trains twice daily, and fog so thick it seems to swallow the landscape whole. I lived on the outskirts of the village, in the last cottage before the wilderness took over. My best friend Patrick lived about 3 miles away, deeper into the hills. We'd walk to each other's houses constantly, especially during summer holidays when the days seemed endless and the twilight lingered until nearly midnight. The quickest route to Patrick's house was by following an old railway line that cut diagonally through the hills. There was a longer road route, but it added over an hour to the journey. And since neither of us had a car yet, the tracks were our highway. I'd walked that route at least 100 times without incident. Yes, it could be eerie sometimes, especially when the fog rolled in from the Atlantic, or when you heard animals rustling in the gorse bushes. But nothing truly frightening had ever happened until that night. It was mid-July, and despite the late hour, the air was unusually warm for Ireland. I'd just gotten off the phone with Patrick. This was back when Nokia brick phones were still common, and mine didn't even have a torch function. He'd asked if I wanted to come over to play the new FIFA game he'd just gotten. I told him I'd be there in half an hour. I grabbed my old Maglite torch, the kind that barely illuminated 3 feet in front of you, told my ma'am I was heading out, and started walking. By the time I reached the tracks, darkness had settled completely. There was no moon visible that night, or if there was, it was buried behind the thick Irish clouds. When I say dark, I mean proper Irish countryside dark. The kind where your own breathing sounds too loud and the hills feel like they're watching you. The only thing keeping me oriented was the crunch of limestone ballast under my feet and the occasional glint of the steel rails catching my torch beam. Maybe 20 minutes into my walk, I started hearing movement off to my left. Could have been anything, a fox, a badger, even one of the thousands of sheep that roam these hills. Still, I stopped walking, trying to hear more clearly. Whatever it was stopped too. I stood there for a while, holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. Nothing. So I convinced myself it was just my imagination and kept going. Crunch, crunch, crunch my boots on the track bed, and then crack. Something massive crashed through the gorse bushes off to my left. I swung my torch toward the sound, but there was nothing but darkness and swirling mist. Whatever it was moving fast, and it seemed to be pacing me. I froze. It froze. I took a single step forward, and whatever it was bolted. It sounded like it ran across the tracks maybe 10 feet ahead of me. I heard the stones scatter under its weight, and then this loud, sharp exhale like a snort, but deeper, more guttural. The air around me went cold, and I don't mean the usual Irish chill. This was different, like the fog itself had turned to ice. I'm not making this up. It was as if the hills had been holding their breath and suddenly exhaled a frozen mist around me. I stood there for what felt like hours, probably only a minute or two in reality. I couldn't move. I couldn't even bring myself to look around, just stared straight ahead, hoping my torch beam would reveal something I could understand. But there was nothing, no eye shine, no outline of an animal, just mist and darkness and the ancient hills. Eventually, I heard it again, but further away this time, crunching back through the gorse on the right side of the tracks. Then silence. I ran. I don't remember the running itself, just the sensation of limestone chips flying and my lungs burning with the damp air. I didn't stop until I reached Patrick's house, hammering on his door like a madman. He opened it immediately and said, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, what's happened to you?" Because I must have looked like I'd seen a banshee. I told him something had followed me through the hills, something big. He laughed at first, thinking I was taking the piss, until he saw the genuine terror in my face. We stayed up all night, every light in his house blazing, not even touching the FIFA game. We just kept looking out the window, half expecting to see something staring back through the fog. The next morning, I insisted we go back and check the tracks. I needed to know if I'd imagined it all. We retraced my steps, and sure enough, right where I'd heard it cross, the limestone ballast was scattered across the rails like something massive had bolted across at full speed. There were strange impressions leading into the gorse, but the peaty ground was too soft to hold clear prints. They weren't hoof marks, though, not like any sheep or deer tracks I'd ever seen. Just long, deep depressions in the earth. We didn't follow them. To this day, I still don't know what it was. Could have been a muntjac deer, but they don't usually charge at people and then stop short. They definitely don't pace you from the gorse without making more noise. The old folks in the pub later told me stories about something that's supposed to live in those hills. Something that's been there since before the tracks were laid. Some nights when I'm up late and the fog rolls in from the Atlantic, I still think about it, that snort, that feeling of being watched by the hills themselves. When I visit home now, I take the long road. Some shortcuts aren't worth taking. My name is Lena, and I'm a 27-year-old software developer working the night shift for a Stockholm-based tech company. When the pandemic hit, my partner Thomas and I had just welcomed our daughter into the world, and soon after, our company sent us equipment to start working from home. Thomas's parents, who lived with us in our spacious Swedish apartment, offered to help with the baby during our night shifts. My mother-in-law, Astrid, usually takes over at 4 in the afternoon, giving us time to get some rest before our work begins. She's a godsend, always making sure we have traditional Swedish dinner ready before we start our shifts. I typically start work at 8 p.m., while Thomas begins at 10 p.m. This schedule means I get up earlier, and he usually continues sleeping until his shift starts. The thing about me is that I've always been sensitive to the unexplainable. I wouldn't call myself a medium or anything like that, but I've had enough experiences to know when something otherworldly is present. When I first experienced sleep paralysis, I managed to stay calm, having read about it online. I knew the best approach was to remain peaceful, ignore any hallucinations, and let sleep return naturally. Once I started working nights, these episodes became more frequent, and I eventually got used to them. But then something different happened. I usually wake up to my alarm, but this time I found myself alert before it went off. Rather than check my phone, I decided to lie still and try to fall back asleep, as Thomas was still sleeping peacefully beside me. The room was dark, with only the faint glow of the northern autumn sunset filtering through our blackout curtains. A few minutes passed, and Thomas moved in his sleep, putting his arms around me in a warm embrace. I was about to drift off when our bedroom door opened, and in walked Thomas. For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then I looked beside me at the blanket, which seemed to be deflating, as if whatever had been embracing me had simply ceased to exist. I stared at Thomas in the doorway as he switched on the light and asked if I wanted some dinner. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Chills ran down my spine as I sat there, unable to form words. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to nod and get up. Once we were in the kitchen, I told Thomas what had happened. He was skeptical, knowing about my sleep paralysis episodes, and suggested it was just another one. A few days later, I found myself in the exact same scenario. I woke up before my alarm and was scrolling through Instagram, reading about the upcoming Midsummer Festival preparations. I felt Thomas roll over next to me and face the other direction. This time I knew I was awake. I was literally in the middle of typing a comment. Then I heard Astrid calling for Thomas from the kitchen, and he answered, but not the one lying next to me. I heard his voice and footsteps from the hallway, heading toward the kitchen. I didn't dare look at whatever was lying beside me. I just shook my head and whispered, "Nedge, Nedge, Nedge." "No, no, no," and ran out of the room. In all my years of experiencing unusual phenomena, doors moving on their own, lights flickering, voices calling my name, I had never encountered anything like this. Having something inhuman touch me, embrace me. It was beyond terrifying. I returned to the room a few minutes later to find it empty. When I told Thomas about the second incident, emphasizing that I had been wide awake this time, he finally took me seriously. We spoke with his parents, and his father, Eric, shared something unexpected. He mentioned that in Swedish folklore, there are beings called Väsen, nature spirits, that can take human form. Some are friendly, others decidedly not. We've since moved our bedroom to the other side of the apartment, and I never sleep in the old room alone. We had a local elderly woman, known for her knowledge of traditional customs, come to perform a ritual cleansing of the space. She burned sacred herbs and spoke ancient words in a dialect I couldn't understand. When she finished, she told us something that still gives me chills. She said that during long Swedish winters, when darkness rules for months, certain entities are drawn to human warmth and energy. Sometimes they become fixated on a particular person, trying to draw energy from them through physical contact. The experiences have stopped since the cleansing, but I'm still extremely cautious. I've placed protective runes above our new bedroom door, not because I necessarily believe in them, but because whatever was visiting me seemed to respect old Swedish traditions. Sometimes when I'm working late and the winter darkness presses against our windows, I think about those embraces, how they felt so real, so human, yet so fundamentally wrong. In a country where the sun sometimes doesn't rise for weeks, you learn to respect the darkness and what might dwell within it. This happened about 4 years ago in the remote highlands of New Zealand's South Island. Back then, I lived in a small cottage surrounded by vast sheep stations, where the nearest neighbor was half a kilometer away in any direction. I loved the isolation, the way the stars seemed to pour across the sky at night, unmarred by any artificial light. My daily walks were a cherished ritual, usually taking place between 7 and 8 in the evening. The route I followed was a winding farm track that formed a natural circuit. The first segment was exposed, running past other farmhouses where at least someone would notice if anything went wrong. Mobile reception was reliable there, and the track was well maintained. The second half, however, was different. It disappeared into a stretch of native bush about 200 meters deep, running between the farms and the back road. This dense vegetation extended for the full 2 kilometers at the rear of the property. During daylight hours, this section of the walk was beautiful, full of ancient totara trees and the songs of tui birds. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely. I was never afraid of walking alone, even after dark. The worst wildlife you might encounter in New Zealand is a startled possum or a particularly aggressive sheep. Sometimes I'd even walk at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, letting the sound of moorpork owls keep me company. Looking back, this was incredibly naive, and after what happened, I never walk after 6 in the evening, always making sure there's at least some daylight left when I set out. It was late at night. I can't recall the exact time, but the darkness was absolute. The only illumination came from my torch, casting shadows among the twisted branches of the totara trees. I was approaching the turn in the loop that would bring me back into open farmland when I heard it. Help, the voice was emotionless, completely flat. It just repeated that single word over and over. I pulled out my earphones and turned off my music, wanting to make sure I wasn't imagining things. But the voice continued, mechanical and monotonous. Help, help, a part of me, a very stupid part, almost responded. My first instinct was to think someone might genuinely need assistance. But then my brain engaged, and I realized that approaching that voice in the darkness would be monumentally unwise. Unfortunately, my cat had followed me on the walk, as she often did. Instead of backing away with me, she started moving toward the voice, her fur bristling as she let out a low hiss. I remember desperately trying to call her back without making too much noise, hoping whatever was out there hadn't noticed me yet. But I was getting increasingly panicked and didn't want to leave her behind. So I darted forward, scooped her up, then turned and ran back the way I'd come. There was no way whatever it was hadn't heard me. I was making enough noise to wake the dead as I crashed through the undergrowth. The image of something emerging from the darkness behind me filled my mind, but I didn't dare look back. Despite not hearing any pursuit, I didn't slow down until I was safely inside my cottage, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Even then, there was still a part of me that worried someone might have genuinely needed help. So I called my friend, who worked for the local search and rescue. She came over in her truck, and we drove to the location with the high beams on. We called out multiple times, but there was no response. Neither of us left the vehicle. Even hardened rescue workers know better than to wander into the bush at night. We drove home having found nothing, but it still bothered me enough that I asked her to return with me at first light. The morning inspection revealed nothing, no signs of disturbance, no evidence anyone had been there. No bodies, which had been my worst fear, thinking perhaps someone had been injured and gone into shock, explaining the emotionless voice. A week later, I learned that several hikers had reported strange experiences in the area of voices calling for help, but always in that same monotonous tone. The local Maori elders spoke of a padupaer, a fairy-like creature from their folklore that was known to lure people into the bush, never to be seen again. I don't know if what I encountered was supernatural, or simply someone with ill intentions. The thought that it might have been a person actually terrifies me more than the idea of padupaer. Because if it was human, they knew exactly what they were doing, trying to prey on people's natural instinct to help others in distress. These days I still walk the circuit, but only in broad daylight. And when I pass that section of bush, I swear I can feel eyes watching me from among the ancient totara trees. The moorpork owls still call at night, but sometimes, when the wind blows just right, their hooting sounds almost like words. Some voices are better left unanswered. I was about 20 hours into my solo trek through the Carpathian National Park in western Ukraine. If you've never been there, picture ancient beech forests with trees as old as time itself, their massive trunks wrapped in emerald moss, and mist that dances between them like ancient spirits. The wild mushrooms grow larger than dinner plates, and the silence is so profound, you can hear your own heartbeat echoing in your chest. I always found these mountains peaceful, using these solitary trips as a way to clear my mind and reconnect with nature. This time, though, something felt different. I'd hiked the Carpathians many times before, but for this journey, I wanted to explore the less traveled paths, away from the tourist routes. It was just me, my dog Grim, and my grandfather's ancient brass compass. Grim, a magnificent Carpathian shepherd, was trotting ahead of me on the narrow path, his ears alert but his tail relaxed. We'd been doing these trips together for 5 years now. He knew the drill better than most humans would. My backpack was heavy but manageable. Tent, sleeping pad, portable stove, food supplies, water filter, trail journal, bear spray, and my compass. The compass was probably the most personal thing I carried. It wasn't fancy, just an old brass navigational tool with intricate mountain engravings on its case, and a crystal face that had guided mountaineers for generations. My grandfather had given it to me on my 18th birthday, just months before he passed away. The brass was worn smooth from years of use, and there was a small dent in the lid where it had once fallen against a rock face during one of his own adventures. Every trip I took, that compass came with me, always secure in its designated pocket on my chest strap. Around midday, I came across a clearing that seemed to exist in its own realm. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy in golden beams, illuminating a carpet of soft moss and fallen beech leaves. An ancient fallen tree, its surface smoothed by time and weather, created a natural bench. A small mountain stream whispered nearby, its crystal-clear water dancing over colored stones. It was the perfect spot for lunch. I dropped my pack, unclipped Grim's leash, and stretched my tired legs. He immediately flopped onto his side and began contentedly chewing on a pine cone, his usual trail ritual. I fired up my small camping stove and prepared some mountain soup, not exactly gourmet, but warm and satisfying after hours of hiking. After eating, I pulled out my journal and started sketching the view. The stillness was everything I'd come here for. About 20 minutes later, I noticed the stove had tilted slightly. Its valve stuck partially open. I reached down and unclipped the compass from my chest strap, using its flat edge to gently tap the valve back into alignment. It hissed, realigned, and shut properly. I remember placing the compass down next to me, its brass case catching the sunlight, the lid flat against my tarp. I even remember hearing the soft clink as the metal gently connected with a stone beneath the fabric. I continued writing in my journal, packed away the stove, and gave Grim a few more minutes of sunbathing before preparing to move on. Everything felt normal, grounded, until it didn't. I scanned the tarp as I folded it, no compass. I blinked, then crouched down, checked my chest strap, checked under the stove, brushed off the tarp again. Still nothing. I dropped to my knees and started searching, first methodically, then with increasing urgency, brushing moss and leaves aside, feeling with my hands, turning over rocks. Grim came over and sat beside me, tail wagging as if this was some new game we were playing. I laughed at first, saying out loud, "All right, ancient mountain spirits, very funny. Give back my grandfather's compass." 15 minutes turned to 30. I retraced every movement I'd made, looked under the log, under my pack, even checked inside my rolled-up tarp, in case it had somehow gotten folded inside. It was nowhere to be found. The compass, the one I'd used countless times, the one I knew I'd placed gently down, had simply vanished. And it wasn't just the fact that I'd lost it. It was how 1 second it was right there, reflecting sunlight, and the next it was gone, as if the mountain had swallowed it whole. Eventually, I stood up, wiped my hands on my pants, and exhaled heavily through my nose. "Whatever," I muttered, "it'll turn up. It must be in my pack somewhere." I hated the thought of leaving it behind, but there was nothing but bare earth and scattered leaves. It had to be in my gear somewhere. I had 8 more miles to cover before nightfall, and couldn't afford to waste any more time. I didn't want to empty my pack and repack it here, so I clipped Grim's leash back to his harness, shouldered my pack, and hiked out of the clearing with this weird, unsettled feeling in my gut, like something had taken it. But I shook that thought off, told myself I was just being paranoid. The trail after the clearing climbed in slow switchbacks, winding its way through denser forest. The trees grew older here, more ancient, their moss-draped branches reaching down like gnarled fingers. The light shifted too. That warm midday glow got swallowed by the canopy, until everything was bathed in this deep, ethereal green. I was in my head for hours, replaying every moment. Usually, I'd chat with Grim and marvel at the forest around me, but not now. It wasn't that I was upset about the compass anymore. Not really. It was more like a weight had settled in my chest, not heavy exactly, but present. Grim walked closer to me than usual. He normally ranges ahead, ears perked and nose down, only checking back now and then. But as we moved deeper into the woods, he stayed tight to my left side, tail low, steps cautious. We didn't see another soul all afternoon. I passed a few old trail markers, their wooden posts weathered and half buried in the earth, and eventually followed the stream up toward a bluff that looked promising for camp. It took longer than I wanted. My legs were done, and the light was thinning fast, but when we got there, damn, the bluff overlooked a bend in the stream, maybe 50 feet below, with thick trees guarding three sides, and a flat patch of pine needles soft enough to sleep on without a pad. I dropped my pack and took a long drink from my water bottle, while Grim sniffed the perimeter. It should have felt like peace, but something in me stayed alert, like I hadn't truly relaxed since I lost the compass. I fell into my routine. That helped a bit. Tarp out, tent staked. Wood gathered, fire ring built with smooth stones from the stream's edge. Grim curled up in the tent and chewed lazily on a stick like nothing was wrong. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was just rattled because the compass was sentimental, that it was stupid to carry emotional weight over an object. But still, it stuck in my brain like a splinter. As I boiled water for dinner, I kept glancing at the forest edge, not because I saw anything, just because I had a feeling. I made freeze-dried stew, but couldn't enjoy it. Grim got his usual trail mix and dried meat combo, which he devoured in seconds. Then the sun dropped. It's amazing how fast it happens out there. 1 minute you've got this soft twilight. The next it's pitch black and your fire's the only source of light for miles. I sat with my back to a log, fire crackling in front of me. Grim curled against my thigh. That should have been my moment of contentment. But instead, I felt exposed, like my fire was a beacon, and something was watching just beyond the reach of the glow. I told myself I was being dramatic, tossed another log on the flames, wrote a few lines in my journal, then gave up halfway through a sentence. The words just weren't coming. Eventually, I crawled into the tent and settled Grim beside me. I left the rainfly open so I could see the stars through the mesh. I don't remember falling asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a loud sound, not cracking branches or anything obvious, more like a shuffle, a faint drag across pine needles just outside the tent. Grim was still, his breathing shallow, ears forward, eyes locked on something. Neither of us moved. I listened, holding my breath, but there was nothing else, just silence. That heavy, suffocating kind of silence that lives in ancient woods, like the trees themselves are holding their breath. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't speak, just waited until my breathing slowed again, then closed my eyes. But I never fully went back to sleep. When the sun broke through the trees, I was relieved. Grim was sitting up, stiff and alert, staring straight out at the fire ring. I followed his gaze and froze, because sitting on the largest stone of the ring, plain as day and centered like someone had placed it with deliberate care, was my grandfather's compass, the same one I'd lost. The brass case caught the morning light. The crystal face gleamed like it had been freshly polished. There was no dirt on it, no moss, no dew, like it had never touched the forest floor. I just stood there staring at it, my whole body gone cold. Grim whined low in his throat. I stepped slowly out of the tent, barefoot, crunching pine needles underfoot. I walked to the fire ring and knelt down, reached out, hesitated, and then picked it up. It was cold, the handle was clean, and yet it was unmistakably mine. The small dent in the lid, the worn spots on the brass where my grandfather's fingers had gripped it 1,000 times before mine. My compass, back from nowhere, perfectly placed. I didn't hesitate for long. I packed up and we got out of there. Tent stuffed, half folded into my pack. Grim leashed without his harness, just looped through his collar. I didn't even eat. We were gone down the bluff, back to the trail, moving faster than I thought I could with a 40-pound pack. Grim stayed right at my side, his ears flat, his breathing sharp. And the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever returned the compass to me didn't want to hurt me, but wanted me to know that it could have. We left that bluff like it was on fire. I didn't even glance back, didn't check for anything left behind. I knew deep in my chest that I had to go right now, and if I stopped to second guess it, I might not move again. Where I had felt at peace in the familiar forest the day before, now felt like we were being watched. No stalked. We made it 3 miles before I even registered how hard I was pushing. My thighs burned, my shoulders ached. The pack was digging into my hips, but I didn't stop. Every time I paused to catch my breath, I felt it, that presence, that not quite silence behind the silence. But I didn't turn around. The trees felt closer on the hike out. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe the paranoia. But the trail, which had felt open and free on the way in, now seemed tighter, narrower, like the forest was folding itself around us. I tripped more than once, scraped my shin on a half-buried root. My water ran low, and I didn't stop to refill it. At one point, I dropped my map and didn't even bother picking it up. I knew the way out, and I knew I had to beat the sun to the trailhead. Every so often Grim would pause and turn his head to the trees and stare into nothing. I'd whisper his name and he'd move again, but slower, cautious, the kind of caution that animals have when they sense a predator that doesn't leave tracks. I didn't check my watch for hours. I just moved. What had taken me over 2 days to hike in, I covered in less than 10 hours. By the time I reached the last turn, the final mile to the trailhead, my legs were jelly. My boots were soaked from a stream crossing I didn't bother to navigate properly. My brain was humming like white noise had replaced my thoughts. But as the trees started to thin, and I caught a glimpse of the gravel parking lot through the branches, something inside me finally unclenched. We didn't stop until we hit the truck. I opened the back door and Grim jumped in without being told, curled up immediately, chest heaving, eyes locked on the tree line. I sat in the driver's seat, windows down, heart hammering, and just breathed. I was out. We were safe. I didn't go home right away. 2 towns over, I sat in a cafe parking lot for a while, just to be around people trying to come back to reality. When I got home, I put the compass away in a wooden box at the back of my closet until I could decide what to do with it. I haven't gone back to that part of the Carpathians. When I retell this story, when I've told friends or other hikers, I've always hit this wall, this moment where I feel like I'm betraying something, like I'm not supposed to be talking about it. I know how that sounds, but whatever was out there didn't want to hurt me. That's the part that messes me up the most, because it had my compass. It could have stayed hidden, but it chose to give it back. It wanted me to know it was there, that it saw me. And once you realize the mountains are watching you, you never feel the same out there again. I was deep in the Rodna Mountains of Romania, setting up my wildlife photography equipment in a remote area where I wouldn't expect to see another human for days. The peaks around me were shrouded in mist, and the ancient beech forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I'd chosen this spot carefully, hoping to capture images of the rare European brown bears that still roamed these remote highlands. One night, I woke up to an unfamiliar sound outside my tent. It wasn't an animal. The footsteps were too deliberate, too measured. I unzipped my tent flap, my heart already picking up its pace. And there, sitting by where my campfire had died down to embers, was a man. He was wearing traditional Romanian mountain clothing, a white loose shirt, dark vest, and a traditional shepherd's hat pulled low over his face. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, mere feet from my tent. No backpack, no gear, nothing but the clothes on his back. When he noticed me peering out, his eyes went wide with an almost unnatural surprise, like he'd seen something impossible. Before I could say anything, he vanished into the darkness with unexpected speed. I tried to rationalize it over the next day. Maybe he was a local shepherd who'd lost his way, though something about that explanation felt hollow. I distracted myself with photography, capturing the dramatic landscape and following animal tracks. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my bones. 2 days later, and 10 miles away in a completely different direction, a route no one could accidentally follow, I was reviewing my photos by the fire when I started hearing movements in the darkness. They were too precise to be animal, too purposeful. I called out in both English and Romanian, asking who was there. From somewhere in the darkness, a voice responded, "Do you know how to find Izvorel?" The voice was oddly flat, emotionless. "No," I replied. "That village has been abandoned for 50 years." They kept talking from just beyond my firelight, asking increasingly strange questions about the mountains, about old paths and forgotten places. I tried to spot them with my flashlight, but they shouted for me to point it away. Something in their voice made me comply immediately. After what felt like hours of this unsettling conversation, the voice seemed to move closer. Against their wishes, I swung my light in that direction. And there he was, the same man from 2 nights before, still in those traditional clothes, still with that unsettling stare. He'd followed me 10 miles, through some of the most challenging terrain in the Carpathians. The moment my light touched him, he turned and fled into the forest. I started to follow, but stopped myself. Chasing an unknown figure into the dark mountain forest would have been suicide. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding, as the sound of his footsteps faded into nothing. I decided the trip was over. First thing in the morning, I began hiking back to civilization, constantly doubling back and checking over my shoulder. I used every trick I knew from tracking wildlife to ensure I wasn't being followed walking through streams, doubling back, laying false trails. The overwhelming sense of being hunted through these ancient mountains was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. That first night hiking out, I heard what sounded like someone walking circles around my tent. By the time I worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing there, just the wind in the trees and that oppressive mountain silence. The second night, I heard what started as animal calls in the distance, but slowly transformed into something else. Something that sounded more like a human attempting to mimic wildlife. Or perhaps it was the other way around. I never saw the strange man again, but those last few days were the most terrifying of my life. The relief when I finally reached my car was overwhelming. I nearly broke down right there in the parking lot. To this day, I can't explain who he was or what he wanted. The local rescue service later told me there had been other reports of a similar figure in traditional dress appearing to solo hikers, but they never found any trace of who it might be. I've photographed wildlife in some of the most remote places on Earth, but nothing has ever matched the primal fear I felt in those mountains. Sometimes, when I look at the photos from that trip, I swear I can see a figure standing in the tree line, watching. Just watching. The strangest part, when I developed the photos, every single one taken after that first night had strange, unexplainable shadows in the background, shadows that seemed to form the silhouette of a man in traditional Romanian clothing, always just visible enough to make you question your sanity. In the summer of 2023, my uncle Andreas invited me on a trip with him and my two cousins through mainland Greece. We spent our first night in Athens before renting a spacious minivan for our journey through the ancient lands. Our final destination was the ruins of Delphi, the ancient oracle sanctuary, but we planned to explore several historical sites along the way. We spent several days driving through the countryside, visiting various archaeological sites and ancient temples. Our nights were spent in small family-run hotels we found along the winding mountain roads. The countryside was beautiful, with olive groves stretching as far as the eye could see, and mountains rising majestically in the distance. On our final leg of the journey, we were heading to a lesser-known archaeological site near Delphi. We got some amazing photos and went on a fascinating tour led by the local archaeological society. The guide told us about the ancient myths and the mysteries still surrounding many of the ruins. As night fell, we were driving around looking for our booked hotel. Unfortunately, our phones were giving us problems due to poor reception in the mountainous area. My uncle was getting tired of driving, and the narrow roads were becoming treacherous in the darkness. We decided to pull over at a scenic overlook to rest and regroup. We took this opportunity to stretch our legs and stargaze. The stars looked absolutely magnificent in the Greek night sky. We were in an incredibly remote area, with hardly any other traffic or settlements nearby. As a result, there was no light pollution, and the constellations glowed with an intensity I'd never seen before. On one side of the narrow mountain road was a steep cliff face dotted with ancient olive trees. On the other side, a deep valley that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. To our surprise, the darkness was suddenly broken by headlights approaching us. A car was slowly cruising down the road. The driver pulled over next to us and got out. He introduced himself as an archaeologist working at a nearby dig site. His dark jacket seemed to absorb what little light there was, and his wire-rimmed glasses caught the starlight in an unsettling way. We greeted him respectfully and asked if he knew how to get to our hotel. He explained that we were quite far from the tourist areas and that there weren't any hotels nearby. He asked how we'd ended up here, and we explained our navigation problems. He smiled, though something about it didn't quite reach his eyes, and began telling us about the ancient temple ruins that we were apparently parked near. He spoke like a seasoned tour guide, sharing fascinating details about the temple's history and the rituals once performed there. Then he offered to show us an unmarked path that only researchers knew about, one that led to a perfectly preserved shrine that hadn't been opened to the public yet. Intrigued by his knowledge and professional manner, we agreed to follow him. He retrieved some equipment from his car and suggested we gather our flashlights. As I was getting my backpack from the van, I watched through the window as he slowly circled our vehicle, his hand trailing along its surface. Once we were ready, he led us a quarter-mile down the road to what he claimed was the hidden path. When we reached the location, he shone his flashlight off the edge of the cliff to show us the trail. I knew this wasn't an official path, but it didn't look like a path at all, just a dangerous scramble down loose rocks. We followed him down an incredibly steep slope, our shoes sliding on loose gravel. He led us around several sharp turns and through narrow passages between the rocks. We found ourselves on a large flat stone platform, and we stopped to take some photos. He continued leading us deeper into the valley, asking if we wanted to see the temple at the bottom. It was dark and we were tired, so we declined. We kept following him for about 10 more minutes, passing ancient stone markers and what looked like the remains of old walls. My uncle grew increasingly uneasy and asked him to lead us back. He agreed and told us he knew a shortcut back up from where we were. He told us to wait there and disappeared into the darkness. We were all nervous at this point because we had no idea where we were. We waited about 10 minutes, taking more photos to calm our nerves. Eventually, my uncle walked off in the direction the man had gone. My cousins and I were afraid to be alone, so we followed him tensely. He came back and told us he couldn't find the archaeologist. We waited another 10 minutes before giving up. "He's not coming back," my uncle said grimly. I began to wonder what could have happened. Did he fall? Did he get lost? Did he abandon us? I couldn't understand why he would have left us there. He had seemed so knowledgeable, and we had been oddly eager to trust him. We started to climb back the way we came. The problem was nobody remembered exactly which route we'd taken. The terrain was treacherous, and we realized we could not safely navigate it on our own. My uncle called out several times, but the only response was his own echo bouncing off the valley walls. We found ourselves testing ledges we were certain we hadn't crossed before. Every step had to be carefully considered, as many rocks were loose and unstable. My younger cousin started to cry, and we had to hold onto her jacket to keep her steady. It felt like we were lost in an ancient labyrinth. My uncle kept muttering that he knew it was a bad idea, but it was too late now. Since this wasn't a real trail, there were no markings to guide us. The only light came from our flashlights, which cast strange shadows on the rocky walls around us. I tried not to look down into the valley. We were incredibly high up. I didn't want to be at the back of the group, but I wasn't prepared to lead either. I just wanted to be back in our van. Our anxiety built as the moon sank lower in the sky. We joked about surviving a night in the valley since my cousin was a scout, but we were merely trying to take our minds off the situation. Finally, we found ourselves back on the large stone platform we recognized. We managed to identify a series of markers we'd passed earlier and climbed back out. It was such a relief to be back on the paved road. We walked toward our van, looking for any sign of the mysterious archaeologist. As we staggered on, we came upon our vehicle, but the man's car was gone. He had abandoned us. We quickly pieced together what had happened and felt incredibly foolish. As I got closer to our van, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I remembered locking it when we left. Immediately, tears began to build up in my eyes. I wasn't sure if the adrenaline had gotten the best of me, or if I truly had reason to be afraid. "Hold on," my uncle said, as he carefully approached the vehicle. My cousins and I were too afraid to go inside, but weren't particularly content being outside either. My uncle took a few steps into the van and blurted out, "We've been robbed." We piled into the vehicle and froze. None of us wanted to venture too deep inside. Our bags had been ransacked, clothes scattered everywhere. My laptop was gone, my uncle's wallet was missing, my cousin's jewelry had vanished, and my other cousin's phone had disappeared, along with other valuables. I felt violated. We were all quiet, and none of us slept. My uncle started the van, and we drove off, searching for signs of civilization. Fortunately, we had enough fuel to make it back to the main road. We contacted the police and filed a report, but nothing ever came of it. The local authorities later told us that there had been several similar incidents in the area. A man claiming to be an archaeologist would gain tourists' trust and lead them away from their vehicles. But they never caught him, and some of the details in other reports were strange, like how he seemed to know things about the ancient sites that even real archaeologists didn't know, or how he could disappear so completely into the landscape. My word of advice: if someone offers to show you an undiscovered ancient temple in the middle of the night, no matter how knowledgeable they seem, say no. Thank you for spending this time with Braderos. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.